Before dawn, the capital smelled of tide and cinders, a mingling as stubborn as old smoke in wool. The sea pushed its breath through the stones of the city, slipped under doors and shutters, brought with it the cry of gulls and the faint clatter of a ship's chain paying out. Lanterns winked along the quays and then down again as if the dark were putting them to bed. A dray creaked somewhere on the street of Flower, heavy with sacks that had been counted twice and would be counted twice again, and the driver coughed into his scarf and waited for the gate wardens to wave him through. The bells in the September of the Mother did not ring. The hawks kept their slept yet, dreaming of quails they would not have until a lord's man rode out with coin. The city's breath steamed faintly in the cool. The king was awake. His chamber lay high in the Red Keep, built to the pattern of a tower room in a northern holdfast. He had ordered it stripped bare of the velvet swags and gold-laced cushions that remained from the last reign. The bed was stout oak without carving. The hearth wore no marble mantel, only brick and a plain iron bar for kettles. On a trestle by the window stood his maps, held flat by stones he had brought from the headwaters of the White Knife. He wore no gown, only a shirt and breeches and bare feet. The flagstones leached heat even through the day, and in the hours before sun they felt like a riverbed in winter. He had known colder floors. He welcomed the sting of it. Cold kept a man honest. John set his palm on the oval stone from the wolf's den near the last river and leaned over the western coast. He knew each smudge of ink by heart, the long, hooked finger of Cape Wrath, the dented shield of the Arbor, the string of islands like a broken necklace. He had walked these lines with his eyes until they were almost a private prayer. They steadied him. He traced by memory the route a ship would take if it meant trouble, hugging Myrish Lane south and then beating up past the stepstones under the lee of the Saffron Straits, or else a boulder captain coming north straight over deep blue to Dorn's pale sands. He knew the reach of a day's fast sail in a good wind. Davos had made him learn. Far places were closer over water than a man uneasy on a throne wished. His crown waited on the table near his maps, a narrow circlet of peen steel hammered flat and hinged with a simple clasp. It was not a fine thing. Gendry had made it in a forge that still smelled of tar and mouse nests. The first day the heat came back into the city after the siege. The smith had scowled with concentration as he lifted the glowing band and set it on a horned stump to work with light taps. Steel sang, and the men around them did not breathe. When he had finished, there were faint hammer moons in the metal, small imperfections that would not polish out. The king had not asked him to try. Longclaw lay in its dark scabbard beneath the trestle. In the gray before dawn, the pommel caught the light and returned it as a wolf's eye might, from deep within. When John looked at it, he saw snow as it fell at Castle Black, fat as feathers, and he heard a horn 3 times in the night and remembered how old fears could wear the shape of the present. The sword had come with a life he had not sought. Now a different life had come with the same weight. He lifted the blade only in need. When he did, it reminded him to step with care, as if the floor beneath a king were ice that might crack. He stood in the window niche and looked out over the courtyard of the Red Keep. Below, a line of women in plain cloaks waited with baskets, patient as stones, heads bowed against the night. Smoke lifted from the kitchens in a thin, blue thread that turned white and then vanished. At the far wall, someone's laughter pealed and cut off at once. A man in a watch cloak crossed the paving with the stiff-legged gait of a soldier who had held still too long. John watched him until the man disappeared around the angle of a stair. Footsteps in the passage outside his door slowed and halted. He knew the pace. It was steady, slightly careful, a tempo learned from months in a bed and then years of making nothing seem heavy. The king did not speak. He waited for the knock. Came softly. "Come," John said. Lord Eddard Stark entered in a plain long coat dark as old pine bark, the hands brooch dull in the low light. His hair tied back with a leather thong and streaked through with iron gray. He did not look at the crown. His eyes went first to his son, no, to his king, and then to the maps. Only after that did he glance around the changed chamber with the small, wry satisfaction of a man seeing a boy's first room made into a man's. The scar behind his left ear showed when he turned his head. It made his profile harder, as a sculptor's last cut makes the figure speak. "You're Abed later than you were at Winterfell," he said, and his voice held the rasp of a northern morning. Jon smiled. "I've been up these 2 hours. The city sleeps differently. It wakes in pieces. So does a kingdom." Ned crossed to the window, looked out, and breathed in. "Salt," he said, as if naming a ghost. "And ash. We'll wash the ash away," Jon said. "We will." Ned's gaze settled on the women with baskets. "Fish wives," he said. "Bread for the watch?" "Grain from White Harbor came in last night," Jon answered. "The first of 3 ships. Davos will give you the figures. They were counted on the quay and again at the gate. They'll be counted by mothers when they're ground to flour," Ned said. "That's the only number the city thinks on." He touched the edge of the table. His fingers brushed the stone from the north with something like reverence, but his face did not soften. "A raven." "From Winterfell," Jon said, and handed over the corded roll beside the lamp. The wax bore the direwolf's head pressed deep. Sansa's seal, ordered, plain, properly done. Ned slid it with his thumbnail. He read under his breath, lips barely moving. Jon watched the feelings pass through his father's eyes as shadows move under ice. Dark first, then lighter, then steady again. When he finished, he read it again more slowly. "She keeps her hand on every door latch," Ned said at last, half to himself. "Good." He looked up. "There's flood in the low pastures near the east gate. She means to move the cattle to the inner wards until the waters fall. She asks for coin from the royal chest to mend the stonework of the outer ford." "She shall have it," Jon said. "There's talk, too," Ned went on, and weighed the page in his fingers as if it had a heft beyond parchment. "Rumor of old men from the neck coming through with bundles no one sees inside and gold leaving the holdfast in well-wrapped parcels. This does not smell as smuggling smells." "Then how?" "With fear," Ned said. "Spooked men pull blankets over their heads and call it prayer." He put the letter down. "She fears hunger, even with White Harbor's ships running south. She asks for some surety, a promise on paper." "You were thinking the same." "Aye, so were you. Promises put in a ledger are not bread in a bowl, but they are an honest start." He studied his son, the lines that interest and care had already cut around the eyes, the way grief had tightened his mouth and then taught it kindness. Ned took that in and set it aside, not out of coldness, but because a steward of hard things could not set them at the center or be swallowed. "Davos. In the yard by first light," Jon said. "He means to look on the south piers with the harbor master. There are worm-eaten planks no eye has cared to name." "Worms always eat when men forget to look," Ned said, and the corner of his mouth moved. "The city is a ship tied to too many ropes. If the knots are bad, the tide will have it." Jon studied the crown where it lay. He reached, clasped it with a thought, and set it in his hands without putting it on. He had tried to make a habit of wearing it only when he must. It did not keep him a king. It did keep other men at their distances, and that made the gaps between people wider than they had to be. "When I was a boy," he said, turning the band idly, "I thought the Iron Throne would be cold like this steel." He smiled without humor. "I thought wrong. It is a seat set over a forge," Ned said. "He who sits there is the coal." "The city is listening," Jon said, "to hear how I crack. It would be better if it heard only what you say." Ned placed 2 fingers on the map where the trident split around the isle with the old fastness. "We have men in the Riverlands with no shoes and girls who have learned to sleep without tears. They will hear that a Stark king speaks and means his words. That will be bread for a time." Jon looked out again, thinking of bread and words and other things that passed for sustenance. A gull flared and took wing from the parapet across the yard, white in the gray. "You told me once that justice is a blade that must be kept sharp," he said. "Not a cudgel." "I told you to wet it every day and to put it away clean," Ned said. "There will be petitioners at midday." Jon turned away from the window. "If they bring old grievances about half a sheep or a son pressed into the watch by a watchman who did not ask before he took, I mean to hear them. All of them. If you want a quiet city," Ned said, Let them sit close enough to see your face. They will not love you for it, but it will make them true." He laid Sansa's letter beside the little pile of other ravens' work. "The small council?" "After breakfast," Jon said. "I want all of them, even the ones with empty chairs." He lifted his head. "Sam sent word from Old Town. He took his vow. His letters have a different hand now." He half smiled. "Straighter." Ned's eyes eased the smallest degree. "The boy always knew more books than men." "He knows more men now, I think," Jon said. "The Citadel will move slowly, but they will move. They will move if the city shakes their shelves," Ned said. He clasped his hands behind his back and looked one last time at the women with baskets. The line had shifted. A girl had set her basket on the ground and was scolding a little boy who had lifted the lid to smell the morning's loaves in hope. Ned watched her careful anger and then took his leave. "I will look in on the guardhouse," he said, "and see whether the watch eats what it is given or what it takes. We will not waste your morning with reports they invented for themselves to please you." Jon nodded. "Bring me the truth if it's ugly." "It will be," Ned said. But ugly truth leaves smaller scars than a well-dressed lie. When his father had gone, the king stood for a space between the maps and the ash smell, listening to the slow wake of the city, and then he dressed with care. The boy who was his man, Rowan, from a fishing village in the Crownlands, who had come to the palace because the fleet had not yet found its sea legs again, laid out plain linen and a dark doublet stitched with white thread in the shape of a running wolf. Jon looked at the embroidery as if it might be too much, then put it on. He took Longclaw from the trestle, felt the familiar weight pull the belt into its groove at his waist, and buckled it without looking. He left the crown where it was. The corridor outside smelled of hammered iron and sawdust. The keep had been patched and patched again. Men with honest hands had covered the ugliness of the old scars with boards and plaster and bands of tin. Art would come later. Strength had to come now. A boy with a ladder stood aside to let the king pass. Jon paused for a heartbeat to put one hand on the ladder's rung to steady it, and the boy's eyes opened very wide. Respect was one thing. Surprise was another. Jon did not want the city to go on being surprised by kindness. He moved on. A cluster of servants muffled their talk as he crossed under the arch into the outer gallery. The air was cooler there, and he saw a gray cat poised on the stone balustrade like a carved thing, tail wrapped neatly around paws. When the cat turned its head, its ears pricked to catch a whisper the king could not hear, and it slid away and was gone. He breathed in the scent of time from the kitchen yards and, beneath it, of men just risen from straw. The breakfast board in the small solar had been laid with fresh bread and little dishes of soft cheese, and a bowl of bitter oranges from the last ship out of the stepstones. Davos was already there, standing by the window, hands behind his back. He had worn good wool against the morning. The fingers he had lost at Storm's End showed pale where the glove ended. He looked like a man resting on a deck that still rolled under him. "You were with the harbor master at moonset," Jon said, and broke bread. "Aye, your grace." Davos had never gotten comfortable with "your grace." The words sat in his mouth like a coin that would not spend. "He's got one good eye and 3 worse judgments, but he knows the names of every man who sweeps the pier and why his broom has no bristles left. He'll do." He took a piece of cheese and then set it down untouched. "There's more silt in the mouth of the Blackwater than a sober man would like. I've crewed shallower harbors, but not with grain as my cargo. We'll take a barge out and sound in the evening. If the wind swings west, we'll feel it in the moorings. Work crews. Half my oarsmen, 24 men who've never seen the Riverlands but know a shovel's use, and as many boys as think a day on the quay is better than a day with a broom." A narrow grin edged the man's beard. "They're not wrong. The quay's only half as dirty." Jon ate and drank watered wine. He felt the food sit well. He had learned to take small meals and often. Too much at once dulled a mind more surely than a morning cup. He nodded at the oranges. "We'll keep the peels. The oil serves." "So it does," Davos said. "Keeps bugs out of the stores. Brings a good scent to the watchhouse so they think they are men, not rats." The smuggler's eyes, gray as tide water, went to the crown, then passed it to the window where he could see a slice of the river's glaze. White Harbor's first ships in, as your Lord Father told you. The Serene done us proud. Wyman Manderley sent a letter with the manifest. It's thick with goodwill and a bit thicker with other things. Other things? A knot of words about recompense for old wrongs and a whisper about new ventures if some rights are recognized. He's too fat to stand on ceremony, so he stands on favors. He always did. Davos's voice held no scorn. He understood men who bargained. They had fed his sons. I told the harbor master to give the Serene a berth out of the way of the tar boats and the rat catchers. A little honor on the quay is worth a great deal in another man's hall. Good, John said. We'll receive his envoys when they come. Manderley sailed through gray seas to put bread in southerners' mouths. That buys him a seat near the fire. Davos made a low sound of assent and finally took a bite of the cheese. Your Grace, he said then, more careful. There's word from the Stepstones. The Triarchy fights itself as often as it fights any man else. But their captains have begun to look west and count slower. They want the tolls, John said. They always wanted the tolls. Davos leaned his hip against the sill. But some men want what they always wanted with more hunger now. There's smoke on the islands where no hearth ought to be burning this time of year, and some ships out of Volantis carry fewer flags than a friendly man would fly. I don't make more of it than it is. I don't make less. He looked up, and something like a smile found its way into the salt and iron of his face. If you'll be king of quiet seas, you'll have to speak loud in a place where men have learned to hear only the clink of coin. We'll send a ship under truce to ask questions, John said. We'll send a ship with teeth if their answers worry us. Said Davos, pleased. A question can be asked in steel as well as in words, though it's a dear way of writing. Brienne came at the end of the meal, tall as a doorway, her blonde hair braided close and her blue cloak clean as new snow. She was Lord Commander now, though the thing sat on her like a second suit of iron she had never asked to wear. She saluted with a fist to her heart, and John returned the gesture. Her gaze went quick to the bread and cheese and then to the spoon with traces of honey. It was the look of a soldier counting another soldier's food to be sure there was enough. Your Grace, she said, the yard is quiet. The night passed without alarm. There was a scuffle by the old iron gate. 2 boys, no more than 12, fighting over a heel. The watch broke them apart and sent them home in different directions. Her voice was even. No whips used. Good, John said. Brienne nodded once. Not out of habit, but in the firm satisfaction of a woman whose men had done what they were told. The morning drill. Begin as you mean to go on, John said. I want the gold cloaks on the walls before supper. Every man. I want them to see the city by daylight when they are not called to fear. They will complain, Brienne said. Men always do. They can complain while they lift their feet, Davos offered. A corner of her mouth shifted. For Brienne, it was a grin. They can, she agreed. The small council chamber had been scrubbed so clean that the wood grain was raw under the hands. Wax marks from years of candle stumps formed faint rings around the places where men had sat and made the world worse by intent or by wit. The window still did not open. The room, like old council, would keep its air unless the king changed its habit. John let the servants prop the door wide with a block of stone. Ned took his place at the right hand of the king's chair. The pin of office gleamed once and then went dull as a cloud moved before the sun. Davos sat near the end close to the window and kept glancing up as if he could smell the river and sea sails he had forgotten to count. A place stood empty for the master of coin, another for the master of whisperers. The Grand Maester's chair held a thin old man with rings enough around his neck to weigh down a bird. Marwyn had not come from Old Town as rumor had it he would. They had sent Maester Conlon, a man who had read as much as he had forgotten and had forgotten only what he had no use for. He smiled at the king as if at a pupil who was clever and not yet wild with his cleverness. The realm is hungry, John said simply when the door had shut and their few bodies had made the room a council. Food first, then roads, then law. Law may need to come second, Ned said. Law is the road that keeps men from walking into one another with knives. John inclined his head. Then law with bread baked into it. He looked to Davos. The stepstones. Watch them, Davos said. Show them your lips and your teeth. A letter to Pentos and to the princes of the Summer Isles would not be wasted ink. Ask what they see. There are good eyes south. Write them, John told the maester. Greet them as friends and ask their counsel as equals. Speak of grain ships and safe passages and the cost we all pay when waters are troubled. The maester's quill scratched. He had neat hands. John watched the bitter little tongue of the quill, thinking how often men made their worlds with such small, sharp things. The reach, Ned said, and Conlan's feathers paused. John turned to his hand. Word from High Garden? John asked. None fit for a raven's wings, Ned replied. That means there is word, and it does not know its shape yet. He rested his palm on a table. There are stewards and uncles and widows whispering behind doors. The Tyrell remnant are quick with flowers on graves, slow with ships. The grain they sit on will be counted and sent when the man who owns it learns whether he owns it truly. The Reach is a great garden with too many gates. Close some, Davos said under his breath. We will not starve the city while they count, John said. We will not seize what we have not paid for. He let the room feel the weight of that, because the habit of taking by right of the sword had flowered and fruited here long before him. Send word to Tarley at Horn Hill, he added. Randall Tarley loves a straight ledger. He will sell what he has no use for and call it virtue. He may even send it quickly if his name is put where the city can see it. Pride can be made to pull. Lord Tarley is proud enough to pull a cart alone for the pleasure of being seen at the traces, Conlan said dryly and wrote. I will phrase it so he feels the reins but not the bit. We forget our master of coin, Davos said into the opening. We do not forget him, Ned returned. We have not named him. That is different. John felt again how thin the chairs were in that room at the places where men should sit. He had not rushed to fill them. A wrong man did damage that a better man could not undo in 10 winters. Yet the work pressed. He opened his hands where they lay on the table. We will ask Lady Eleanor of Brightwater to come to the city, he said. She has a head for sums and the patience to listen. She kept a house and a holding through 2 wars by knowing when to give a loaf and when to sell a field. If she declines, we look north. There is a woman in White Knife Town who tallies fish and salt and ships with more honesty than some maesters I've met. I would rather have a good fishwife count the realm than a lord who counts only his own barns. Conlan made a small approving sound, one scholar humming to another across a bench. Your Grace, he said. The Citadel will grumble that you have overlooked expertise. The Citadel may grumble, John said. The city will eat. That is expertise enough. Very good, Conlan murmured, and his quill moved on. The Whisperers, Ned said, and the word cooled the room. Silence held for a breath, then another. John allowed it, then broke it. There is a woman called Muriel, he said. They call her of the many doors. She has lived in the city since she was born. She knows the houses men come out of when they say they slept in the street. She knows when a man has changed the way he holds his breath. She comes by night to the gatehouse to sell secrets to the watch because she says secrets are like milk. They go sour if you keep them, and they make men sick if you drink them all at once. He looked at Ned. I spoke with her on the 2nd night after the fighting ended. She was sitting on a step eating an apple she had not paid for. She never looked at the apple. She watched feet. Ned listened and the lines around his mouth eased. Not because he liked the thought, but because he was thinking it through. She will not wear a lord's cloak or a maester's chain, he said. She will not sit in this room. No, John said. She will not. She will meet Brienne in the watchhouse and she will tell her what she hears. She will be paid with bread and a purse and a safe room with a lock that works. She will be told that long knives are for chopping meat, not for thinking with. If she breaks faith, she will lose the room and the purse and the bread, and she will have to watch her own feet again. That's a smaller throne than this one, Davos said. but some folk are gladder to keep it. We will begin with that, John said. If we need more, we'll build more. They drafted letters until the candles burned low and were replaced, until the servants came and went like shadows, carrying seals and sand and other small courtesies that made words heavy enough to carry to other halls. They spoke of roads gone to mud and bridges that had lost their middle stones, of a levee in the west that might become a revolt if a boy with a gold pin did not take his hand off an old woman's purse. They spoke of Blackwater Rush, its new shallows, its changed curve where a piece of bank had let go during the siege and made a little island where a boy without a father had found a place to stand and shout. They spoke of things so plain a king should not have to speak them, of latrines and thatch and the habit of washing hands before the bread is shaped. But if a king did not speak them, no one would. By the time the bell in the hall struck the hour of petitions, the room smelled of tallow and ink and men who had not told lies today. John stood, his body aware of its own heft in the space, and the others rose with him. Ned laid his hand briefly on the table, just a little weight, as if to say to the wood, "You will hold." Then he followed his son out into the corridor. The throne room admitted the world in pieces. Light fell through the high windows in bars that made motes shine like little fish. The iron chair stood where it always had, a shadow and a shape and a warning. The back looked like a cliff of dull knives. Men had bled themselves to make this seat. The king did not sit in it for petitions. There was a chair of dark wood with a plain back set on the first of the 3 broad steps. When he took it, he could see over heads without needing height, and the people could see his hands. They came with their complaints like pebbles dropped in a basin. A girl with ink-stained fingers and a ribbon at her wrist asked that the printers in Cobbler's Alley be let bring their paper carts to the fountain at midday, for the alley was too narrow and the paper grew damp. A baker complained that his neighbor had taken the bread list from the door and put his own name at the top. John made them stand together and speak until they had heard themselves. The baker reddened and bowed. The girl was permitted to cart her paper to the fountain only if she dumped no water on the paving and returned before the boys' game of hoops began. Unwieldy drafts were to be dragged around the far side where the shade remained through noon. Conlon was made to write it down and post it so no man could say he had not known. Men remembered what they had been made to read, or else someone read it to them and laughed. A woman of 30 years with a scar across her lip asked for a wagon with a sound wheel. She had taken her wares through the gate of the gods and out to the hamlets because old women could not come to market after the fighting and children were not to be trusted with coin unless there was a mother's eye on them. She sold candles with clean wick and good tallow. Her wheel had split on the cobbles coming down by the smith's yard where the stones were loose. John had Brienne find the smith, and the smith came and looked at the wheel and at the woman and grunted that he could make a better wheel if someone paid for the wood. John named the price and the crown paid. The smith cursed softly and then smiled just a little. It did not hurt to see a king buy a woman a wheel without making a song of it. A thin boy in a patched shirt with hair as black as night came forward with his hat in his hands and asked if his brother might be released from the watch long enough to bring their mother from the other side of the city gates. She had stayed behind with a sick aunt when the siege closed, and now the men at the gate said a pass was required and no passes were given for women without their sons. Ned had the boy wait and went himself to talk with the sergeant of the gate. The boy stood as if he had been told to stay still at a game and did not know when he could breathe. When Ned returned, he had the sergeant with him, a square man with a decent mouth. "This is the request," Ned said, quiet enough that only those near could hear, but the quiet reached the back because it made men lean to listen. When a man is set to watch a gate, you set him to keep out trouble. The trouble is not always a sword. It is often confusion. We will not let confusion be our jailer. The boy's brother will be spared to fetch his mother by noon. He will return by sunset to relieve the man whose watch he interrupts. The aunt's illness is accounted for. The women will be examined by the kitchen matron to see that they carry no pest. The gate will open and close. The city will breathe. The sergeant bowed. He had fought through days when there were no rules but hunger. Rules now were meat. There were other petitions and other answers. They came and went like the tide. When John judged them, he felt the iron chair at his back not as a thing to be feared, but as a memory of what happened when men stopped listening to such small complaints. The air warmed around them as the sun came up. The moats turned to gold. The people left with their burdens lighter or at least sorted, and their faces changed in small ways a king told himself not to count as victories but kept in his mind anyway. By the time the last man had said his piece, the city sounded like a city again. Hammer, hoof, pail, hawker's cry, gull. John stood and felt the stiffening in his knees, the ache in his back that had come in with the crown as quietly as a draft. He stretched it away and found Ned's eye. His father nodded once to the small door that opened into the antechamber behind the dais. John followed. It was a narrow room with a bench and a little table and a window slit that let in only enough light to tell a man the hour. Ned closed the door with his shoulder and leaned his back against it. For a breath, father and son stood without speaking, listening to the low thunder of feet in the great hall on the other side. "You did not once tell a man he was a fool," Ned said at last. "I thought it," John said. "So did I," Ned said. "He will not need us to tell him he was foolish. He needs us to show him how to be less so." John set his hand on the table and felt the old burn scar there under the paint. A snake of raised flesh from a candle spilled years ago. The princes who had ruled then were bones now. Their mistakes remained like knots in wood. He rubbed the scar with his thumb. "There will be men," Ned said, "who think your mercy marks you as a weak blade." "I know," John said. "They will come and test it. We will answer sharp enough to teach, not to maim. And if maiming is required," Ned said evenly, "we will not flinch. There is a kind of mercy that is only cowardice." John's mouth tightened. "I won't be that kind of merciful," he said. He looked up. "There's a sapling in a pot in the kitchen courtyard. It traveled with the grain ship. Manderley sent it. He says it is from a heart tree that grew in a swamp and never tasted an axe. He thought a king might want shade." Ned's eyes softened in a way John seldom saw. The softness was not weakness but a tenderness toward some hard thing inside himself that had borne too much. "We will plant it," he said. "Not in the king's garden. In the common yard. Let the city sit under it when summer comes and learn what your shade feels like. But let there be a guard on it at night. Because men cut what they don't understand," John said. "They are most apt to when it is lovely," Ned said. The day moved. The king walked the length of the inner wall with Brienne and 3 of her white cloaks, listening to the scrape of their boots and the way the city's noise changed pitch as they moved along the face of it. 1,000 small things added and subtracted until the sum changed, like a song altered by a single flute. He stopped at the corner where the stone bore half a char mark from the last battle and put his palm there. The heat was long gone. Men would point at the mark for years and tell one another how it had come. After a while, the story would be wrong in the details and right in its warning. Brienne spoke of gate posts and hinges and watch rotations and the bone-deep laziness of any man who thinks he will not be watched. John listened and asked for names. He would learn the names. It mattered to call them out again to their faces, so they knew a king did not only speak to titles. At the shadowed corner above the old tower, he stopped of his own accord. From there, he could see across the roofs toward the river. The water wore the sky thinly. The sailcloth below was written in triangles of light and shade that fluttered and closed like the throats of great damsels breathing. John stood in the wind and let it push at his cloak and drag out the wood smoke smell from his hair. He felt the itch between his shoulder blades that was not fear but a sense that he was seen from afar. A man with a bow could stand on the far quay and take him in the throat if he had the hand for it and no care for his own life. John put the thought down. He would not feed it. He would keep the guard where it was. Let the city see him, not a shadow. Ned went down into the city with a small company and no banners. He wore a plain cloak with the hood up and walked faster than his household liked and slower than his heart did. Men stepped aside for him because there was something in his bearing that made a lane. They did not know who he was, not at first, or else they knew because the city learns the weight of certain men's steps the way a courtyard dog does. He went to the watchhouse by the gate of the gods and stood in the yard while Brienne's sergeants lined up their men. He tasted their broth, sniffed their bread, put his nose into their water bucket and judged it good and not good enough. He asked who had struck a boy after he had stopped resisting and saw two gazes flick and return and then settle. He put the man's name in his mouth and said it without anger. He said, 2 days docked, and do not make me repeat myself. He said, when I was a boy, a lord told me a blow after a fight is coward's work. He said, if I find you are a coward in other things, I'll not give you 2 days, I'll give you none. And let the man imagine what none might mean. He went to the baker's little shop near the gate where the girl with the scar bought flour. He bought a loaf without showing his signet, and he watched the way the baker's apprentice counted coins with 3 fingers because the other 2 were more flour than skin. He went into the alley and found Muriel sitting on the stone step of a house with a broken door. She had an apple. She looked at his boots and then at the men with him and then at his face. She smiled with no charm at all, like a person who knows the price of the thing you want and will not be haggled down an inch. Your Grace's hand, she said. Only that, Ned said. And a father, she said, and then widened her eyes, mocking herself. Did I say father? What a guess. I meant farmer, a farmer of men. She bit the apple and did not look at it. You want to buy what I sell? We will pay, Ned said. If you sell what you say and if what you sell is worth the coin. It's worth more than you can pay, she said. But I'm not cruel. I'll let you pay what you have. She leaned her head and considered the apple's pale bite. There's a priest with a red sash on the corner by the bell foundry, and he's taken to blessing boys we don't know and girls whose eyes look at you like a cat's do when you hold a fish. He says flames no names. He says no man is his own fire. He's got 3 men with knives who stand like they're waiting to count the wind. I don't like men who count wind for their living. They spend a lot of time looking up. Men who look up trip over little shoes. When they trip, they stab. Names? Ned asked. Of the boys? Of the knives? Of the flames? Muriel shrugged. The knives are called Peter, Jared, and the one who says he was a soldier, but you can tell by his scars he was another thing first. They come from places where their mothers called them something else. The priest calls himself Lawloress Moth. There are many moths. They live on shirts like mine. She looked at her sleeve and brushed ash from it. I see them. The boys like the way the priest speaks because it sounds like a story told by a man who is making it up as he goes and he's too good at it to stop. The girls like his eyes. They're the color of stale ale. She planned another bite of the apple and did not take it. I don't want knives near boys who stare too hard. The boys will blink and those men will not. Tell Brienne where the priest prays, Ned said. We will see if his gods obey the city's laws. He'll call it a trial by fire, Muriel said with a cat smile. You'll call it a fine to be levied for lighting flames where no hearth is. Both are true, Ned said. Truth does not often mind being doubled. Ah, she said. A lord who thinks 2 things can be true at once. How clever. Such men are very hard to rob. She looked past his shoulder at his men. Tell the boy with the thick fingers he hides a sharpness in the right place. There's men who will try to take that sharpness. They won't like where they find it. Ned turned to see Tom, his quietest guard, coloring under the grime. It was not simple to embarrass Tom. He bowed slightly to the woman and she cackled and bit her apple. Finally, like a victory. When Ned returned to the keep in the early afternoon, the water brought a ship on the tide. White sails folded and then let down like an eyelid. It bore the merman on a field of green. The city's watchers called, and their voices repeated, let the name pass along the wall until it reached the king's ears as if the stones said it. White Harbor Envoy. John met them in the yard, not in the hall. He went down the steps without ceremony and stood where the road dust turned to the brick pavers, so a man might know he was not kept to wait and could measure his breath. The envoy was a young man with Wyman Manderley's sweetness about the mouth and steadiness in his stance. He bowed with a kind of grateful pride at being the one chosen to carry good things to a place that needed them. Your Grace, he said, and his voice held a Northman's deeper timbre, as if a wolf had shaped his throat when he was a boy. I bring Lord Manderley's heart and his grain, not in that order. He smiled so that the city's worst parts might forgive him for it. Welcome, John said. "You bring summer on your back." The boy laughed. "It's damp summer, your grace, but it's summer." He cast his eye around the yard and marked what a practical man would. The way soldiers stood, the way a gate hung, the number of dogs, the lack of banners. "We have more coming. We have dried fish as well as wheat. We have a man aboard who can teach a lighter watch than your men keep. He knows how to measure with 2 fingers and never lose a grain. He lost 3 children to winter. He counts for them." John felt something twist under his breastbone, something that was not only pity but recognition. "Bring him to me," he said. "He'll teach us and we'll give him work. His children will eat the elbows of other children here. That is a city's way of remembering their names." The boy bowed again. He touched the edge of his glove where salt had matted it and left a pale ring. He had come by water. His clothes bore the sea's signature in white where it had dried. John saw it and thought that it might be an omen. If a man liked omens, he liked facts better. Yet his eye returned to the ring of salt twice and then a third time, and he did not rebuke his heart for that small habit. Afternoon drew out along the stones. The sun warmed them, then let them cool. Shadows lengthened. Men began to think of the hour when they could drop what they had been holding since dawn: rope, broom, pen, and think of meat and wives and a clean handful of water behind their ears. Brienne's men changed watch. Davos went back to the harbor with a coil of rope over his shoulder, his back interpreting for anyone watching how a man kept his sea legs on land. Conlon returned to his tower with a sack of letters at his hip, tight with the secrets, honest as a ledger. Ned sat at a narrow desk and wrote to his daughter of gate hinges and wheels and small favors a city chooses to remember forever. He did not tell her of Muriel, not because he meant to keep such things from her, but because he knew that to carry another soul's burden through a letter was to make the letter heavier than a raven should have to lift. He would tell her when she came, toward evening, as the light turned amber and the river took that color and made it wine. A small gray ship with no sigil and a wary tilt came slidely up against the quay where men met secrets. It had a name on its stern, Ever, and a crew that looked in 10 different directions at once, not from guilt but from the habit of men who had survived by knowing where something might come from. The captain, a woman with a scar across her scalp that had taken hair with it, came ashore with a package under her arm that crinkled as if it were wrapped in oilcloth and secrecy. Davos took her by the elbow and called her Lynn. He had known her once by a different name, and it was a kindness he pretended he did not. They spoke with heads close together for a while. Then she handed him the package and moved away with a sharp nod that did not become a bow even when he introduced her to the king by title. She looked John in the face and said, "If you make the sea less full of thieves, I'll forgive you for making peace." John nodded. "If I make the sea less full of thieves, I'll have to forgive myself for making it dull." She snorted once and was gone. The package held a sheaf of maps and a list of names written in a hand that had learned to obscure itself. Conlon read it without seeming to squint. It named captains known in Lys as pious men and in Tyrosh as profane, and the places where they took on supplies when the tariffs were highest because they had learned which men could be made to blink. It named a cove on an island where women without tongues were rowed ashore with rings around their wrists and men dressed as monks counted coin. To the side of that name, a second hand had written, "Not a cloister." John looked at the second hand for a long time. It looked like Lynn's. It did not look like a woman who had learned to write in a house with clean floors. It looked like a woman who had learned with her finger in spilled flour, then made ink by boiling the dark down. "We will go there," he said, and Davos, who had not asked for permission, nodded as if the plan had been his and he had been waiting for the king to catch up to it. He would take 2 ships that rode high and fast, and he would take men with him who did not mind not being remembered. He would take a boy who counted in 2-finger measures a grain that was wet as well as a grain that was dry. He would come back with answers or with salt stains where answers should have been. When the king was alone at last, he went to the little court behind the kitchens where the smell of roasting and scalded milk and washed floors had washed the day clean. The pot with the sapling stood there on bricks where a dog could not lift its leg against it by accident. The leaves were not the red he remembered from the godswood of Winterfell. They were a deeper shade, less showy, like blood in shadow. The bark had a pale cast that might become the white he wanted if the tree lived. He put his palm lightly on the young trunk. "You're far from home," he said softly. "So am I." The tree said nothing. The city breathed around it. A boy with a peeled turnip trotted across the yard and stopped when he saw the king's hand on the sapling, as if he had come into a sept and surprised a prayer. He backed away slowly and vanished with his turnip half-raised like a shield. John smiled a little and did not move his hand. Night brought its own order. Lamps lit, shutters drawn, men accounted for or not accounted for. The keep had taken to checking at sunset. It made the dawn less full of surprises. Brienne came twice after sundown, moving with the quiet of a mailed saint, to report on small things that were large. Men who asked to be transferred to a different gate because theirs had too many mothers waiting with questions. A captain who had told a joke about the king and had not laughed when he did. John took in each thing and let it find its place in his head. A king's mind was a storeroom. If you set things where they belonged, you could find them when you needed them. If you tossed everything in a corner, something important would rot. From the north came a raven at last, later than the one that had brought Sansa's letter, slower in the air and hoarse at the throat. It wore black ribbon because someone at Castle Black still remembered how to do such things even with so few hands left to tie the knots. The letter was in a neat, careful hand that was not the old maester's, and John knew before he looked at the signature who had written it. He read the words by the light of a single lamp with his head bent and the sword's hilt touching the edge of the table as if it wished to read along. There were fewer men now than ravens at the wall. Tormund sent his love and his rudeness and a carved horn that smelt of mead and old horn smoke. The snows had held late and then gone too quickly, and the ground was still so wet in places you could lose a man in it if you did not tell him where not to step. A she-bear with 3 cubs had taken to lying in the lee of the old ice, and the men at Eastwatch had learned to shake their cloaks before putting them on because mice had learned to climb into them to sleep. There were girls and boys now in the little houses under the shadow of the wall. They were not prisoners anymore. They planted and fetched water and learned to take turns. Some of them would never see the world beyond the trees. Some would go south one day and find that you could have a wall in your head as much as in front of your face. The letter said these things without tears and without simple hope. It said that a world after a long night was not a world waiting to be made perfect, but a world already made imperfect which men could keep from coming apart if they used both hands and did not stop to argue about who should lift first. Samwell's name was there at the end, big and brave at last under the words. John traced it once with his thumb and then folded the letter into the place where he kept what mattered. He looked at the candle flame for a long time. He thought of the boy who had cried in a stable the first time he held a sword and how much larger the world had grown around that boy until he had found a place that fit his size. He thought of vows spoken to old stones and how vows could make a man taller without changing his height. Ned came slowly then, as he did at the end of any day he could find his feet to make the walk. He did not need to speak. John passed him the letter and watched his father's mouth as he read it. Tightened at Tormund's love. It relaxed at the mice. It curved at the line about the wall in a man's head. It turned rueful, faint, at the signature that had once been a trembling set of scratches. He found his hand, Ned said. He did, John said. Sometimes men's hands find them, Ned said. He laid the letter down and put one hand over it for a moment as if he were keeping it from blowing away in a wind neither of them could feel. There will be nights when you doubt the shape of what you've made, he said, and his voice was no longer the hand's voice, no longer a lord's, just a father's in a quiet room. There will be mornings when you think the city is a beast you cannot feed, and you will think it kinder to let it go wild. You will not. You will keep feeding it, and you will lead it with a rope that looks much too thin until it learns not to pull. When you are most afraid, you will say what you know to be true, and then you will say it again. That is a king's work. John looked at his father's lined hands and at the way the lamp made a halo of light around the white threads in his hair. He looked at the shadow of the crown where it lay on the table. He looked at the sapling through the little window, a mere dark line against darker night, and felt something like relief that it did not ask him for anything yet. The tree would demand a different kind of patience, and he had that. He had learned it watching snowfall. "Tomorrow," he said, "we will plant the sapling." Ned said. He looked at his son with a satisfaction that was not pride's hot flare but the cooler thing that comes when something has taken root. "We will need a spade with a narrow throat. There are stones under there where the old mucky ground was brought up to level the court. We'll cut our hands if we're not careful." "We'll be careful," John said. They sat for a time in the simple companionship that men may find who share the same labor, even if one wears a king's ring and the other a hand's pin. Outside, the city laid its cheek on its own shoulder and tried for sleep. It would not all sleep. Cities never do. Somewhere a woman sobbed once and then stopped, either because comfort had come or because it would not. Somewhere a man laughed too loudly and then coughed. Somewhere a cat killed something small and made a meal of it beneath a wagon. Somewhere a boy told his sister a story about a king who ate only turnips because he did not want to take bread from a mother's mouth. And the sister said that was foolish because turnips were bread made by the earth and kings were not meant to eat like rabbits. These things did not change much, and yet they made the city different than it had been the day before. By moonrise, a little knot of red fire had gathered near the bell foundry. Brienne went herself with 6, not because she feared a fight, but because she would not put a sergeant to something that might turn ugly if words were not cleanly chosen. The priest's sash looked like it had come from a bolt of silk carried in a better time. It gleamed when the lamplight struck it and then looked cheap when the lamplight moved on. He had the fervor of a man who has learned that a handful of words can stir men into being more than they wish to be and is not yet wise enough to fear that power. Brienne stood, boots apart, and told him the law about public flames and knives in a voice that could be heard 2 streets over without sounding like a shout. He listened and smiled and said that the true law burned in men's hearts, and she said he was welcome to burn his heart in a room with a door and not in a street where the straw from the stables lay too close to the curbs. He spoke of trials by fire, and she told him he could have a trial by coin. 3 silvers for the use of the curbside and 2 for the light. The men called Peter and Jared, and the other one with the wrong scars shifted, and Brienne shifted her weight in a way that said, "Do not." The priest read her body better than her words and bowed. Muriel watched from a window where a shutter hung like a broken tooth and bit into her apple and laughed, but softly, because she liked her teeth. Near midnight, a small boat put in at the king's gate and tied with care, the knot neat and quick. A figure in a dark cloak stepped out and stood a moment as if listening for a footstep that would tell him whether to go back or forward. He went forward because men who come inland by water seldom choose the road back. His face would be known to most eyes that had seen a battlefield and few that had not. He moved like a man who had never forgotten what it meant to be asked too late for help. He carried in his pocket a strip of cloth torn from a banner that no longer had a pole to fly it. He had come to pay a debt, and to ask one, and to see whether brothers could live in a city large enough for them both. He would find out. Not that night. There was time yet for certain meetings, so long as morning came again. John slept for a while at last. He dreamed not of battles but of the crypts of Winterfell. He walked past the statues with a candle in his hand and saw how the flame made his forebears' faces move and settle, as if they had felt a draft through stone lungs. Lynna's stone eyes looked past him as always. He wanted to ask her if she had written a letter too, the first year she had been dead, just to see whether the raven could carry it. Instead, he sat down on the cold floor and set the candle beside him and rested his head against the carved wolf at her feet. He knew he was a king in the dream. The stone did not care. It did not warm to him. It did not grow colder. It allowed his weight and neither comforted nor rejected him. It was a relief. When he woke, there was a smudge of ash on his cheek where he had leaned too close to the hearth in the night. Rowan came in with a basin and paused and then smiled and pretended not to have seen it, the courteous mercy of servants. John washed his face and put a hand through his hair and looked at the crown and then at the light in the window and chose bread before steel that morning. He ate simple porridge with salt and a little honey because the bees in the palace gardens had endured and someone had not stolen their hives. He went down to plant a tree. Ned came with the narrow spade and a length of board to ease the roots and a coil of rope he would not use but had learned long ago to bring anyway. two boys watched with flat eyes that turned bright when the first dark layer of good earth opened. A woman in a shawl stopped, then pretended not to watch, then watched openly and with plain skepticism. The kitchen matron came with a bucket of water and corrected Ned's stance with a sharp, "No, no, like so." And he grinned at her like a boy and did as he was told. The sapling went into the ground with a sound like a throat clearing. It stood as if it did not trust the idea of standing. John knelt and tamped the earth with his hands. "Will it take?" asked one of the boys. "If it is stubborn," said Ned. "If we guard it," said John. The woman in the shawl sniffed. "Men plant what they cut," she said. "If I see a knife near it, I'll bite the hand that holds it." She did not smile. It was not a threat most men would fear, but there are some mouths in a city that men know better than to dare. "Thank you," John said. "Don't thank me," she said. "Thank whoever decided to put it where I walk." She turned her face away and pretended she had liked the idea from the start. When they were done, Ned straightened with a little sound that spoke of the body keeping accounts against time's cruelty. John rose and looked at the tree and at the yard and at the men and women and boys around them who tried not to make too much of a king with dirt under his nails. He looked beyond the walls, through stone and air, toward the ships and the islands where new trouble grew, toward the rivers, toward the winter roads standing up again in the north under carts with iron-banded wheels. He looked at all of it as if it had been written for him to read, and for a moment, only a moment, he did not fear the task. He had work to do that did not require a sword. He had battles to fight that would never be called wars, though their casualties might be worse if he lost. The souls of men, the patience of children, the habits of a city, the hunger that ate through hope long before it ate through flesh. He began at the outermost ring, as he had on the wall, watched the horizon, count the lights, listen for wings, and then worked his attention inward until it rested where he stood. The day smelled of damp earth and bread. The city's heart beat, slow and stubborn. He matched his breath to it and went to meet what came. By noon, a rider from the south had reached the city with a letter pressed into his jerkin. Words from Dorne written in a hand that curved like sand under wind. By evening, Davos had taken 2 ships out where the river decided to become the sea, and where law grew thin and men thickened their courage with wine and the thought of other men's money. Before the next dawn, Miriel delivered a name in a whisper that made Brienne lift one brow and say a single, short word that was not a curse but would serve as one if she needed it. Before the week ended, a raven out of Old Town brought a fatter letter with fewer excuses and a small parcel that smelled of parchment and oil, from a place where men read too much and lived too little. Before the month turned, the tree in the yard put out a new leaf. None of these things alone would decide the fate of a throne made of swords, but they would bend it. Bent steel is stronger if it has been tempered. A kingdom, perhaps, could be tempered too. At night, when the city lay on its side like a tired hound and only one ear flicked, when candles burned shorter and men remembered they were mortal again, the king sat sometimes with his father and spoke of small matters with the weight that great matters had once possessed. They measured out the future in such talks and in such silences. The room kept their words and gave nothing away. The lamp held its flame and asked nothing. The maps lay flat beneath the stones. The crown waited on the table, a simple circle, the mark of a man who had accepted a yoke and meant to pull. Winter had taught Jon Snow how to wait. Summer would teach him how to nourish. Autumn would come in its time and show him which of his harvests were true and which were only straw. For now there was morning work and noon work and evening work. He kept to them. He chose men and women whose hands remembered what honest labor felt like. He kept his own hands clean when he could and dirty when he must. He listened to small complaints and heard the large failures in them. He made promises he could keep and not otherwise. He forgave often and did not forget. He cherished mercy as a tool and used it with care. He grieved for what could not be mended and did not let grief make him cruel. In a tower over the river where the wind ate letters if a man did not hold them down with stone, he wrote a note in his own blunt hand addressed to a woman who had not returned to the city when fire might have found a different shape. He did not write her name. He wrote only the words, "There is bread here. There is a place for a dragon to sleep if one should come." He did not send it. He put it under the stone from the wolf's den near the last river and left it, as a man leaves anything that must be found or not found not by will but by weather. On the third night of the new moon, a boy crept into the kitchen yard with a knife to cut bark and carry it home to prove he had touched the king's famous tree. The woman in the shawl woke from a dream of her husband when he was young and, as promised, went down and bit the boy's hand. He dropped his knife. She smacked him on the back of his head so gently he almost cried more, then took him by the ear to the watch. The watch laughed until Brienne looked at them, and then they stopped and wrote the boy's name and sent him home with a bandage and a lump of bread. The next morning, the woman in the shawl came to the king's breakfast hall and set her hand on her hip and said, "Do better doors." And John said, "We will." And then he found a carpenter who had been drinking too much and told him a king needed a door made by a man who had forgotten how to be thirsty. The man straightened and sobered and made a door that swung sweet as a well-tuned note. Little things. The city changed by them the way a face changes when a man's mouth earns to smile not at jest but at grace. When the envoy from Dorne at last appeared, robes dusted with wind, a veil across the lower half of her face that let her eyes do most of the speaking, she entered the throne room as if it were a courtyard too hot for noon, and did not bow more than 5 degrees or less, a courtesy measured by a ruler Dornish carpenters had built. She brought with her a little chest with a lid like a book's and said in a voice that held water, "The prince sends figs that eat like meat and a question that eats like a figure. He asks what kind of peace you mean to keep. The kind where his sons grow to manhood without being counted before their beards come," John said. He rose to his feet and did not climb the steps. "The kind where my sister rides to Sunspear without a spear in her back. The kind where we pay for what we buy and do not buy what we do not need to own." She regarded him through the veil. "He will ask about old debts." "We will pay what is owed," John said. "Not the interest usurers invented in dark rooms when war kept decent men in the field." "That will be a long talk," she said. "Long talks keep hot blood in the veins," John said. "We will drink water while we speak." She blinked slowly, an acknowledgement both amused and grudging. "Very well," she said. "I will write that the king offers figs for swords and water for wine." She looked past him to the iron chair. "He offers a chair for a stool. He offers a seat that does not cut a man when he sits," John said. She bowed 5 degrees and no more. The figs she left behind were as promised, almost like meat, and the question likewise. He set them side by side and knew that he would eat both. On a morning one cannot call remarkable because it held only the weather and the common commerce of day, Arya came to the city on a small ship with a black sail that bore no sigil because sigils had never done her any favors. She walked down the gangplank light on her feet like a thought, and the guards at the gate did not see her as they did other travelers because she had no need for that kind of seeing from men. She climbed the steps up the hill to the red keep with her shoulders loose and her jaw set in that way of hers that made men fear to ask her any soft question. In the corridor outside the room where John had his maps, she stopped and put her palm on the wall, not to steady herself but to greet the stone as an old friend. She smiled once, small and private, at a memory that was not joy but held joy's bones. Then she opened the door and went in without knocking. John lifted his head at the shift in air more than at the sound of the door. He stood as if a gust had come and steadied him. For a second, they were children in a winter yard again, damp on their knees and noses white with cold, with a stick for a sword and a dog yelping as it galloped madly past. Then they were the people they had become, who did not need to be introduced to their shadows. "You look like a king," Arya said. "You look like yourself," John said. "Good," she said, and stepped into his arms in 2 strides. She did not belong to embraces, but this one belonged to her. Ned came a moment later, drawn by laughter the two had not known they were making, and he paused at the door as if he had found his heart beating outside his own chest. He came forward slowly, and Arya turned and bent her head and then lifted it as if she were mentioning to the gods that she had done so. Ned put his hand on her shoulder and felt bone and power there, and she turned that shoulder under his fingers as a hawk turns when the falconer holds out the glove. He did not reach for the children they had been. He reached for the woman who stood before him. There would be more. Words to be spoken and not spoken. Work to give to hands that could not bear to be empty. Old angers to lay on a table and send away in pieces so small they would go down a drain. There would be other faces at that door. In time, faces that would change the line of the future with a question or with a blade. There would be nights that would challenge the lamp and make it smoke. There would be mornings that would smell of ash again and others that would smell only of bread. For now there was this. A king, a hand, a sister, a room with maps, a crown on a table, a sword sleeping under its owner's hand, a tree in the yard learning how to stand in southern soil, a city learning to breathe without choking on its own smoke, a sea that did not care about any of it and would not until men taught it to. John sat with Arya on the floor by the window as they had once sat in a corridor in Winterfell. Knees up, hands around shins, two children practicing the habit of not making a noise. They made noise now, not loud, enough to fill the air with the fact of themselves. Ned leaned against the trestle and watched them and thought. The gods give gifts in their own time and without being asked, and sometimes a man is wise enough to know one when it comes. The day lengthened. The city moved into it with the graceless grace of a great beast too big for any stall and yet gentle when fed and spoken to. Work waited in stacks, in scrolls, in men's throats, in women's open palms. There was no rush to reach it all. A reign could be built the way a wall is built on a sound foundation. A stone, then another, then a third, each fitted to its neighbor so well that water runs over them and cannot find a way in. They would place the stones. They would measure twice and cut once. They would stop sometimes and look up at the sky to remind themselves that a wall was meant to be strong enough to protect the people under it and modest enough to let them see the stars. And then they would begin again because any work worth doing is made up mostly of beginnings. The morning after the planting began with a thin film of dew on the kitchen yard stones that made the light seem wet. The sapling's leaves held beads of water like small, careful thoughts. A pair of doves found the rim of the rain cask and drank without moving their bodies more than breath required. The cook's girls came out with their sleeves rolled, glanced at the little tree as they would at a child not their own, and set to the business of feeding a keep. The world was ordinary with a kind of relief. Arya rose early, not because she wished to be seen industrious, but because her body had never forgotten the hour when hard things begin. She drank hot water with a shred of lemon, the sour cutting clean through sleep, then went into the yard. She stood by the sapling and touched her knuckles to the bark without a word. Men watching might have thought her paying some northern god her courtesy. She was measuring the flex of the trunk, the way a thing yielded and then held, how much a man would have to pull to uproot it. She looked at the rope coil on the bench where Ned had left it and at the two boys from yesterday who had appeared with hands held behind their backs as if bound. "Let's see your palms," she said, and they showed her the bandage on the smaller boy's hand and the clean hand of the elder. "Good," she said. "Keep that cloth dry till dusk. Don't make the tree remember you that way again." They nodded, serious as scolded dogs. She watched them go and knew by the way their shoulders settled that they were relieved to have been seen. The city had that need as much as meat. John met her there, a cup of barley drink in his hand, and sleep softened out of his face. He nodded toward the leaves. "We did a simple thing," he said, with a faint thread of wonder in it, as if simplicity were a creature that came only when called by the right name. "You did," Arya said. She looked him over and made a small, satisfied noise. "You're eating. That helps with ruling, so I've heard. It helps with walking from one end of the hall to the other without listing," he said. He turned his wrist and let the liquid circle the cup's rim. "I'd put you to work," he added, as if he had not been thinking of it since he'd heard she was on a black-sailed ship. "If you want it." "I don't want a chair," she said at once. "You'll have none," he said. "I want your feet where doors close." He glanced up toward the lines of the red keep, windows like squinting eyes, and where men stand to one side and let their shadows do the listening. She made a shape with her mouth that might have been a smile and might have been a challenge to the morning. "Brienne has men who hear their own boots and nothing else," she said. "She's making them hear two things at once. That's hard." "It is," John said. "Do it with her. Not under her and not above. Beside." Arya nodded once. She had a way of giving a scent that did not soften her. "Where do you mean me to start?" "There's a priest with a red sash," John said. "He speaks as if he were telling a story to a hungry hearth. Hungry men like him. Muriel doesn't. I find I like Muriel's dislikes." "I'll listen," Arya said. "If he wants flames, we'll let him have candles no bigger than his thumb, and he can sing to them with his sash wrapped up in his own belt." "You'll have Brienne's men to hand," John said. "I'll have myself to hand," Arya said. "Brienne can do what Brienne does." He let that sit between them like a bowl they would fill later. "Last night," he said, "a man came by water and asked for the keep with no name given. He sent in a word, debt. He sent in a second, service." John's eyes lifted slightly. He wore no colors. The gate captain described his hair as gold gone to ash. "Jaime," Arya said, and did not make it a question. She had seen him last riding west with his jaw set in the strange resolve of a man who had decided to want something decent after a life of wanting other things. "Brienne will have a look." "She already has," John said. "She says, if I mean to take him in, I should do it before the city sees him and remembers everything wrong at once." "He is everything wrong and everything not, both," Arya said flatly, thinking of lists and names said to herself in a whisper that had ground itself into her bones. "If you want him, take him as a man, not as a story. Stories make men into their worst shape." "I mean to measure him," John said. "I won't ask you to do it. It wouldn't be a fair ask." "I'll say if I see him reaching for something you don't," Arya said. "And I won't stay in the room when you give him his place or send him away." He heard the small iron in that and was grateful for it. "Thank you," he said, which not many brothers would have. She took the thanks as if it were a piece of bread offered after a run. At the far side of the yard, Brienne appeared with her cloak over one arm, and a face on that made men remember their oaths even if they had never sworn them. She saluted the king and glanced at Arya and then at the tree, as if confirming that nothing had happened to it while her back was turned, which told John that she had slept poorly and considered herself foolish for it. "My lord," she said to Ned, who came with a narrow spade across his shoulder as if the work were not done and might need doing again. "The red-sashed man has a tongue like a knife that won't cut meat but will pry boards. He draws boys. It's the boys who make me uneasy. The knives only follow." Ned set the spade down and leaned on it and listened to the three of them weigh a priest as if weighing oats. Heavy, light, rat in the sack, weevil in the bin. In the end, they chose the same as they had chosen the night before. Let him speak until his words struck law, and then make his coin bleed as much as his rhetoric. Arya went down into the city with Muriel an hour before midday. Muriel limped a little on the left. She said the limp came from a fall off a roof when she was a girl, and then added that if it pleased Arya, she would change the story tomorrow and say it came from fighting a bear. "Men like a bear," she said. "They like to think some woman once fought one without blushing, and that gives them courage to ask for an extra ladle of stew later." She blew a peel of apple skin out from between her teeth and led Arya into a lane where the air smelled of boiled linen and yesterday's fish bones and the sadness of people who had been told to wait one more day. The red priest stood on a crate beneath a broken bell, his sash a wound of color in the gray. He was handsome in a way soldiers' wives might forgive themselves for noticing. His face had the kind of symmetry that suggested gods favor men who speak for them, and his eyes were as advertised, stale ale with a film over it. He saw Arya because she stood where she could be seen, and he filed her away as a woman who would not be persuaded by metaphor. He had 3 men behind him who watched hands more than faces. Muriel named them in a whisper and added that the one with the soft boots had a sister who worked mending nets and was worth saving. The other 2 had long since been bought by something not worth the coin. Arya listened as the priest spoke of a fire that did not burn and a promise that did not dim and a king who would never tire, because those were the words he had learned brought the small piece of wonder that loosened purses. She watched the boys watch him. The boys liked the way he moved his hands and how the sash made a line in the air when he turned. A boy with a crooked tooth leaned forward until his brown hair almost fell into his eyes. Arya shifted so if he tripped he would land against her leg, not against the crate where a man could crack a skull. When the priest spoke of flames that knew names, Arya tilted her head, because she had known a flame that seemed to know her once by the lake with a man who made men into less than they were and more. She shut the memory away and looked instead at the knives. When Peter smiled, it was with all his teeth and none of his humor. Jared had a left elbow that never quite straightened, which told her how to turn him if she had to. The third man carried his weight on the balls of his feet in the way of former Sellswords who had learned to like running as much as fighting. She placed them in her mind as one places 3 cups on a shelf. This one above this one here, if it falls it will not break something else. Brienne arrived at a pace that was not hurried and not slow and placed herself where the priest could not continue without acknowledging the law. She told him what he could do and what he could not, and his smile in answer was genuine. He liked being told where the edges were so he could press at them. He spoke soft and said his God's light obeyed no man's law. She answered that she would not argue with a god but men would keep their blades sheathed in a street where children ran. He found that witty and said so. She had no wit to spare for the remark, and the men with knives measured that shift. Arya let them. When the moment came, it was not one of the men who moved first but a boy who wanted to touch the sash. He jumped and missed and jarred the crate, and the priest stumbled a quarter step and one of the knives came forward, not to cut, to steady, but to steady in a way that put the blade between child and cloth. Arya's hand closed on the knife wrist before the thought of closing had reached the man's elbow. She turned her hips so his body naturally followed, and he found his face pressed to the crate, not hard enough. Brienne's gauntlet settled warm and steady on the second man's shoulder. The third's eyes went wide in a way that told a smarter truth about him than any scar had, and he put his knife back in its sheath without prompting, which was good to know. 3 silvers for the curb, 2 for the light, Brienne said again, this time to the priest's men and not to the priest, as if they were the ones capable of counting. No blades in the crowd. If you want a blade out, show it to my sergeant before sun falls and he'll tell you where to stand. We have rights, Peter said carefully into a plank. You have laws, Brienne corrected. The priest put his hand to his heart and offered an apology that was not one, then turned it into an oath that sounded sweet to boys who had never learned how sweet poison can taste. Arya lifted the boy with the crooked tooth by the back of his shirt as if she were lifting a pup. She set him on his feet and tapped the side of his head with 2 fingers, and he looked wary and proud both. Miriel leaned down from a doorway to spit an apple seed and giggled when it slid down Peter's cheek. By noon, the matter was settled in the way such things are. By coin and by women who watch, by the cooling of men's pride, by new watchers set at corners. The priest found that the city let him sell his god provided his god bought his license like any other merchant. He did not like being included in such reckonings. He liked not liking it. He stayed. Miriel took Arya down a different lane where a man sold old nails by weight and a girl with a scar sold candles with good wick. In the throne room after the midday bread, Jaime Lannister came as he had promised in no words, with his hair cropped close as a penitent's and the false hand gloved, not polished, and a cloak that had known rain. He left his sword outside the door with a guard who did not want to hold it and did not dare refuse. He entered to find no iron chair occupied and Jon on the lower seat that had become the place where justice sounded less theatrical. Brienne stood to one side and could have been carved from some northern stone that never takes a soft edge. Ned was present because this was a thing that ought to be done with fathers near. Jaime bowed his head with a soldier's exactness and lifted it again. There was less swagger in him than in memory, the way a man loses a taste for sweets as he ages. There was more bone, more silence. He reached into his cloak and drew out a strip of cloth and laid it on the table between them without flourish. The lion's head was faded almost to a shadow, the red nearly pink from weather and salt. I've been a sword for many things, he said, his voice low and even, as though he knew the room would record it and he meant it to. For my father, for a king, for a woman, for myself when I was young and thought myself worthy of serving no one. I've been a shield for fewer. I would be a shield now. It is the only debt I can pay that does not spend another man's coin. Whose coin did you spend? Ned asked, quiet and without heat. When you killed the king you were sworn to protect? The realms, Jaime said at once. It was the debt I owed to the mothers who would have burned. I have never asked forgiveness for it. I have only asked that men understand which vow I kept. They don't have to like the one I broke to live because I did." John watched his face. He saw there a man who had told some truths long enough to make them less grand and more tolerable, and some untruths too, and learned which was which only late. He saw weariness that was not of the body. He saw, to his own surprise and to the ache of it, a loneliness that resists company more than it longs for it. "What debt do you mean to pay here?" John said, and did not look at Brienne, though the air between her and Jaime was a taut string. "For a city burned and a throne that was almost another kind of fire," Jaime said. "For a girl I scorned when I was young and who saved me when I was not. For a realm that needs swords to sleep and men who know when to lay them down. For my house too, but not in the way men think." He touched the rag of banner. "There are larders at Lannisport that are not yet empty and stewards who keep their keys in their sleeves. There is coin in the rock that you could haul up by the bucket if you think you can name what it pays for. My sister taught too many men to think gold is a law. My father taught me better. He taught me fear. I would like to teach your captains something else. The habit of hearing a king and thinking of justice first, not of counting." "And what do you ask?" John said, "because men like Jaime do not come bearing only gifts." "A chance to be used up," Jaime said, almost with relief at having come to the simplicity of it. "Don't put me where a song can find me. Put me where mud and silence live. Send me to roads where men have learned to rob and call it tax. Send me to a bridge that broke in the rains and a village that stopped believing the crown could count to 10. If I'm to die by any man's hand, I'd rather it were a farmer whose field I failed than a lordling whose jest I spoiled." Ned's eyes moved once to Brienne and back to Jaime. He saw the line of the past between them, and he saw the shape of new service that might not break what was half-healed. He did not trust the gods to be gentle. He trusted certain choices. "Lord Stark," Jaime said, and the title caught in his mouth and made him smile at himself. "You told me once with your stare that there's a way to hold a sword that keeps a man honest. I've learned some of that. I haven't learned all. If you'll have me, I'll learn the rest with your men breathing down my neck." Brienne found her voice, and it was rougher than she liked. "King," she said quietly, eyes on John but meaning Jaime to hear, "if you send him to work, send him under oath to me." John had thought as much. "You'll swear to the hand," he told Jaime. "You'll swear to the crown, and you'll swear to the Lord Commander. If you break faith with any one of those oaths, you'll be judged by all of them." Jaime nodded, and when he bowed his head for the words, his hair flashed pale and then dull. He spoke with the plainness of a man who had learned that oaths mattered most in small things. He swore to go where he was set and to take no coin but his pay, to take no favor that bent justice, to raise his hand against no man under a banner of truce, to return to answer if he was called. He swore to keep silence where silence protected others and to speak where words would save a life. He swore, last, not to ask mercy as a way to bargain past a punishment he had earned. When he lifted his face, he looked older by a year. Men always do when they have told the truth to their own ears. "You will go to the Riverlands first," John said. "There is a bridge at Stone Mill that needs a road laid to it on both sides like a thought that connects two halves. There's a band of men there who once were soldiers who have learned to count on fear for their meat. The levy out of Fairmarket has grown bold and began to shave coins. You will stop it. You will not break men who can be mended. You'll bring me the names of those who cannot, and I'll put my name to the writ that takes their hands. You will not take hands without a writ. You will not make widows of men who don't deserve to be ghosts." Jaime's mouth twitched slightly, his first sign of life apart from control. "You have a talent for spoiling a warrior's fun," he said. "I have a talent for wanting children to have fathers," John returned. Brienne breathed, one deep draw of a woman who had been holding more in her chest than she should. He heard it and did not turn to look at her. He let them be two trees in a yard that had to learn the same wind again. After Jaime left under escort, the room did not fill with talk. Ned looked at the strip of banner and turned it once so the lion's face saw the ceiling instead of the table. "There is a manner of service in him," he said at last. A man can be wicked and devout both. Will give his devotions honest labor. Brienne will keep his sword pointed where it should be, Jon said. She always has, Ned said without irony. Davos was a day and a night on the water by then, his 2 ships taking wind the way old men take a blessing, grateful and with a bit of suspicion. He had a crew made of the Crownlands and the North both, men who had never seen the Stepstones and men who had learned to name the islands by the color of their smokes. He stood at the rail and watched the moon pour silver on the seam where sea and sky marry and then part and marry again. Lynn's map lay weighted under a bit of shot on the box beside him. He had marked the cove that was not a cloister with a fingernail nick. He did not flatter himself that the nick alone would carry him there. He learned long ago that a sailor's luck is just the name he gives to his collection of sensible habits. They sighted the island in the pale hour before dawn when shapes are made, not seen. The cove wore a fringe of dark stone teeth and a veil of scrub, and the water in it had a tucked-in quality, as if hiding something under its smooth. Davos brought the ships up and let them sit like beasts that do not yet wish to drink. He took a boat with 8 men he trusted and 4 he meant to learn, their oars kissing the black in slow rhythm. The smell came first, wrong for dawn. Tar warmed too early, blood not yet washed, the iron in it. Then the sound. A soft, regular clinking like a weight against wood that told of a chain whose owner did not move of his own will. He signed them to quiet with 2 fingers, and they became the shadow people become when fear instructs them well. On the shingle, a man in a false monk's robe pissed into the water and smiled at the ripples as if the sea were a toy. Davos disliked him at once in a way that had nothing to do with judgment and everything to do with the frank recognition of a man who takes pleasure in kindling small fires. He let the man finish and turn, and then he stepped from shadow and was simply present, the old trick of smugglers. Make yourself inevitable and men forget to shout. "Hello," Davos said. "Wondrous dawn." The man blinked, confused by the politeness, as they usually were. "This is a cloister," he said late, misremembering his line. "It's not," Davos said. "You'll be asked for different prayers than you thought." There were 5 of them in all, a tidy number that had looked larger in their own heads. 2 ran toward a bell that was only a pan on a nail, and an arrow out of the scrub thudded into the pan and made a surprisingly modest sound. One fell over his own hem and broke a tooth with a noise that made the men behind Davos wince sympathetically. The other 2 had knives. They had used them before. Davos let the younger of his men move first, and when the young man stumbled on a stone because he had not yet learned how treacherous shorelines are, Davos put the flat of his hand on the boy's spine and righted him without speaking. The boy recovered, blessed twice, once by the contact and once by his own embarrassment. By the time the ship's boat had kissed the wet stones twice in quick succession, the false monks were on their faces and the little bell pan lay dented where the arrow had found it and a gull had landed to see whether the dent held food. In the dark of the cove behind a canvas hung to look like a fisherman's drop cloth, they found the women. 7 of them with eyes that had learned to be dull, one who would not let her eyes go dull and would pay for it later in a different way. They had cloth wound around their wrists where iron had rubbed the skin raw. They did not cry out when the canvas lifted. One of them made a small sound that might have been a swear if she had any god left to call upon to damn someone. Davos had brought water with a sprig of mint in it. Nothing sweetens a cup like something grown, and he handed it out with both hands, as if receiving something from them. His men cut the cloth and then the little wires twisted into wrists, and they helped the women to stand. One fell immediately and then laughed, appalled by the strength of her legs' devotion to the floor. The laugh was a wrong sound here, and so it was perfect. "Ladies," Davos said, and the word went into their bones like broth. "You're aboard with us now. You'll not be harmed. You'll not be asked a question you don't wish to answer. You'll not be told to pray." "What if we wish to pray?" asked the one with the light still in her. "You'll find a corner," Davos said, "and do it there. The sea listens. She's poor company, but she's just." Lynn's name delivered the next step. They found a ledger and a little box of wax seals for an order that pretended to be religious and was not. The ledger had more ruin in it than any sword. It named buyers and ports and half a dozen men who had learned to use the words pious and prophet in the same breath without choking. Davos wrapped it as carefully as he would have wrapped a child in winter and took it to his chest and did not let the sea wet it. On the way out of the cove, a Lyseni captain in a strip-built boat slid out from behind the tooth of rock like a fish that has learned which angle to present a hook. He had a smile a patrician father would call winning and a dagger his mother would not have wanted to see in his hand. He told Davos politely that he was in violation of 3 understandings and offered to help find the shore again, for a price. "I know the shore," Davos said. "I've been finding it since before you lost your first tooth." "Ah," said the Lyseni, "but did you know this shore has 2 mouths?" He shifted a small lever set into the rib of his boat. A little thing, oiled, well-made, meant to open a hole in a man's future. A net shot out heavy with little hooks meant to catch oars and slow a boat like a fish. Davos had set knives ready at his men's feet for exactly this trick. They cut in rhythm, a sound like short breath. The net kissed and peeled away and floated like a dead jelly. The Lyseni's smile slipped just a quarter inch. He lifted his hand as if to call on a god and found himself looking into the eyes of a man who had outlived half the gods by refusing to be impressed by them. "You can come aboard and speak to a king," Davos said. "Or you can wash your knife in the tide and go home with a story about the day you lost a ledger. I'll take either. Choose." The captain chose poorly. It was not admirable. It was predictable. He lunged for the ledger and found Davos's old hand where his throat wanted to be. Not hard, again hard enough. A boy from White Harbor. Salt line on his glove still white. Stepped forward and took the dagger out of the air as if catching a tossed apple. The Lyseni blinked, shocked by the intervention of a youth in a world he had thought crowded with gods and lords. He sagged a little and wept one tear, a convenient one. Davos tied his wrists gently with rope, because he had learned that men tied too tightly are more trouble than they're worth. He delivered women to the ship and the ledger to a dry chest and the Lyseni captain to a coil of line where the man could practice seeing what a coil looks like from within. When the 2 ships made back up the Blackwater with freed women and a ledger and a captain whose smile had reverted to the set certain boys perfect in their beds, word went before them along the watch chain, and the quay was ready. Water, blankets, a fire controlled and contained, a midwife, a woman who had once lost her daughter and had learned which words to say to other women that had nothing to do with comfort and everything to do with the naming of small survivals. John came down into that receiving and did not stand where he could be seen until he had stood where he could do some carrying. A bundle, a bucket, a rope. When the women looked up, they saw a man with a crown in a boy's face, and some of them smiled without knowing why that did not hurt them. Conlon took the ledger with hands that did not shake and set about making it legible to men who had never been made to care about such writing. He read aloud names and places and dates and prices until even men who could not read could find their way through the pattern. He murmured that this would do more to change the shape of a certain stretch of coast than any number of gallows, and Ned, who had seen gallows do their work and then fail to keep working, said only, "Aye." In the small council chamber after the river had carried the salt far enough inland, they laid the ledger beside a map and placed stones on it where each name had its port. It looked like a sickness blooming. It looked like a cure, too, because maps have that kindness. They make problems small enough to put a finger on. "We will send letters to the magistrates of Pentos and the princes of the Summer Isles naming these men," John said. "We will ask for their proof and will give ours. We will offer witnesses and we will accept theirs. We will not pretend we can clean a sea by ourselves. The Triarchy will bristle," Davos said. "They can bristle while their captains starve," Ned said, "cold as a water bucket in winter. Hunger has a way of sanding down bristles." Lady Eleanor of Brightwater arrived the next week with 2 trunks and a ledger bigger than most men's heads. She wore a gown a shade of gray no courtier would choose and a brooch made from a piece of abalone shell turned into something like a blossom. She had a mouth that set itself exactly when she finished a sum and a manner of looking at a person that made them want to square their shoulders and take a second, deeper breath. When John met her in the yard as he had met the Manderley envoy, she looked at his hands first, to see if he wore ink or dirt, and nodded when she found both. "I'm not a lady in the way men think of ladies," she said without preamble. her accent reached pure and unsentimental. "I am only that by marriage. I am a head for figures and a back that learned to lift a barrel when a man dropped it. That is the only kind of master of coin that is worth paying." "That is the kind we asked for," John said, relieved, as he always was, when a person named the thing plainly. "I will not spend a dragon to save a stag," she said, and the music of the reach made the sentence almost beautiful. "I will not let a man cheat because he likes his cheat neat. I will not let a woman starve because a Lord Steward thinks barrels empty themselves. I place my ledgers in public light when I can. I keep one that no man except the king may read when I must. Both are honest." She tilted her head. "I do not flatter men. I flatter accounts when they merit it." "We do not want flattering," John said. "You will still hear it," she said dryly. "And when you do, you will send those men to me and I will give them work instead." She took her place at the table and opened her big ledger, and the room acquired a new sound, the sound of numbers being tethered. She listened to Conlon read off Stepstone's names, and she wrote ones, fives, tens, hundreds in neat stacks, clicking her tongue softly when the ledger revealed something too clever by half. She drafted a notice to be posted at each city gate naming the crown's wheat price for the week and the fine for anyone found selling a full measure as a half. She drafted a second, to be written in smaller hand and posted where men who believed themselves safe from reading might be forced to read by their sons. "If you sell bread made with swept-up flour, you will be given a broom and sent to sweep the gate for a month while mothers pass by and insult your manhood." Conlon smiled behind his quill at that. "Fear of insult," he murmured, "is a more ancient law than fear of a lash. Men will pay to avoid it," Lady Eleanor said without humor. Sansa's letter arrived on a stiff cold wind that remembered wolves. She wrote of the east gate flooded again and then mended, of a child lost and found, of the way the old men from the Neck had begun to tell other men's children stories of frogs that sit on rafts and steal fish from men with their wits about them. She wrote of the heart tree in Winterfell's Godswood and how young men had begun to sit with their backs to it and count their breaths until their fear had fewer places to sit. She wrote of Brienne in a postscript, only a line. "Tell her the black mare folds safe, a colt with a blaze like a crooked spear," and of Arya only a word when. She sealed the letter with the dire wolf again, and John pressed the wax with his thumb until the wolf almost blurred. Randall Tarley's response came in a different hand, as if a clerk had pressed the letter out of iron. It named weights and amounts and times and made demands dressed in courtesy. Lady Eleanor read it and snorted like a small horse. "He wants to be paid twice," she said. "Once in coin and again in praise. Give him the first. Leave him hungry for the second. He'll bring us grain to feed his pride on his own. Men like this cannot bear to carry a harvest that no one sees." "Publish the price," John said. "Send payment with a note that says we'll announce publicly where the grain came from if he likes." "And if he does not like?" Eleanor asked. "We'll announce it anyway," John said. "Let him sue me in his hall for ruining his humility." "Very good, Your Grace," Eleanor said, and went away liking him. News passed more quietly through the city than it had in years. Men would say later that the city in those first months learned to hear without shouting. The heart tree in the yard put out 3 new leaves where men could see them if they looked hard. The woman in the shawl began to sit on the kitchen step at noon in a kind of fierce satisfaction and watch men walk by without cutting. Muriel began to bring names to Brienne and to Arya with the simplest of assessments: keep, cut, sell back to their mothers. And Brienne began to trust the woman not because she liked her but because she preferred the taste of truth even when apples sweetened it. At dusk one evening, as the harbor held in its breath before releasing it to the night, Conlon climbed the narrow stairs to John's chamber with a lamp and a look that said he was about to say something that would make other men write plays later and make this man only more careful. "A glass candle burned at the Citadel last night," he said without ceremony. "Samwell watched it burn. He does not make sport with words. He writes that it was green as a heron's leg and steady as a watchful eye. He says he dreamt of a man he did not know, a stranger in a hall that smelled of wet stone. He says the man said his name and then laughed and then was gone." John took this in like a sailor takes weather, eyes on the horizon, tasting the coins of salt on his tongue. "What do you want me to do with that?" he asked. Nothing, Conlon said promptly. And everything. Do not trust any man who tells you he understands candles. Do not let any man who laughs at them near your maps. Tell Samuel to write when he sees such things and to keep a bucket of sand by the candle. Tell him you would like a copy of the Ravenry schedule for a month. Tell him to close his window on nights when the moon is thin. John nodded. Done. He smiled despite himself. You have more patience for oddness than other maesters. Oddness asks for patience as payment, Conlon said. It rarely gives change. Jamie left for the Riverlands with 40 men and an oath in his mouth. Brienne watched him go from the gate with her visor up and her jaw set in a way that made boys think better of swearing their own oaths in public. He looked back once and she lifted a hand and let it fall, the kind of salute one gives to work well started. He rode like a man who had finally found the right pace. Not to get somewhere, simply to go and be equal to the road. He reached Stone Mill in rain that made the world particular. You could only see what was near and everything far became an idea. He found the levy collectors with their skirts full of shaved coin and their justifications mouths practiced. He listened until he heard which one liked the sound of his own voice and which one liked the sound of other men's fear. He took them down not with theater but with rope and clear words. He set the rope in public in a way that did not make a spectacle and yet made a memory. He made the men take off their own belts and hand them to the oldest woman in the crowd, and he sentenced them to weeks of rebuilding the road with those belts holding up their trousers. He made them return the shaved coins double, not to the crown but to the men they had stolen from, and he stood with his false hand hanging like a history no one wanted to read while he watched each coin pass from one palm to another. He found the boy who had first brought the complaint to the wrong kind of man and put him to work counting stones. When a farmer came to him that evening with a pitchfork and the air of a man who wanted to be brave in front of his sons, and said that if Jamie were truly sorry for all that had been done in the Riverlands, he would let the man take an ear, Jamie stood very still and gave him the ear the man did not want to cut. The farmer lowered the pitchfork and spat in the mud and said, "Build the bridge." And Jamie said, "Aye." At King's Landing, Lady Eleanor and Conlon together drafted a charter for a harbor court where the master of ships and a merchant and a watch captain would sit together and judge quarrels at water's edge without making men climb the hill of visions for a verdict they needed before their fish rotted. They named hours and fines and the number of words a man could say before he had to pay a penny to continue talking. People laughed when they read it and then loved it when a loud man had to pay. The court sat under a canvas stretched between two posts with stones at the corners to keep it down. It smelled of rope and penned goats and old sea and new justice. Dorne's envoy returned with a second chest and a question under the lid. The figs were fewer. The letter was longer. The prince wrote that he would send water north in wineskins if men wished to drink water that way. But the question he sent was this: "What do you mean to do about the memory of Elia and her children?" Men in the city who knew how such questions bend nations listened for the reply. John wrote that he meant to set justice's foot where it had not been set, not with show but with stone. He wrote that the men who had done the killing were long dead or else ghosts already in their own houses, but that a thing not paid for sits at a table and eats and eats. He wrote that he would call a council of lords and small folk in the capital to speak Eliah's name in the hall and set aside in public a portion of the crown's income each year to endow a house for women and children without names, to be named for her, where no man could take a mother's child in the night. He wrote, last, that when he spoke of her, he would not speak as if her name were a banner to be waved but a stone to be kept in the hand. Brienne frowned over the letter and then nodded. "That is the right kind of saying," she said. "I've heard the wrong kind my whole life." A coarser business came threaded through the finer. Wildfire residue in cinders sold in secret. Men had spent years teaching themselves that ash could be turned to fear. Muriel told Arya that there were those who paid boys to gather scrapings from old vaults and carry them wrapped in cloth to a house near the dragon pit where a scarred man with a W tattooed near his thumb weighed ash and weighed coin and did not blink when either scale went wrong. Arya watched 3 nights and then a fourth, and the 4th night she watched the man lock his door and slip out the back with a small packet and go up into streets where domes cut the sky. She followed without sound and found him standing in a circle with 3 others, one who had the careful walk of an alchemist, and one who had the careful walk of a coward, and one who carried himself like a city rat grown into a man. They spoke softly of fire, as if it were a cousin they could not keep out of their house. When they finished, Arya stepped into their circle and held out her palm for the packet. The coward took a step back. The rat stood still because he had learned that movement draws the eye. The alchemist said, "Now," and reached for some little glass thing in his sleeve. Arya's fingers were faster than the thought his brain sent. She took the glass and set it against the wall, and it broke with a sound like a small sigh. The others stood looking at their own hands, surprised to find them empty. Brienne's men arrived then, as arranged, and took the three gently at the elbows, and one of them started to cry, not because of fear, because of relief. People who live in plots are grateful when someone throws their plot away for them. There was no theater of punishment. There were logs to be carried, ash to be soaked and the water thrown away under a watchful eye, fines to be paid in labor at the riverbank where mothers could look at the men and talk to them while they worked until the men learned to dread that more than a lash. The alchemist was sent to sit under Conlan's lamp 4 hours a day and copy clean treatises on soap and oils until his eyes stung. If he wanted to turn a substance into a marvel, let it be something that made hands clean. Gendry came to the yard with a coil of iron strap over his shoulder and his hair smelling of smoke and beeswax. He looked at the door the carpenter had made for the yard and then at Jon and said, "It wants a bar set inside that runs on a smooth track and nobody can lift from the other side with a hook. I've made the hinges. They won't complain." "Do it," Jon said. "Then go to the south piers and look at the wormed planks with Davos. He trusts his eyes. I trust his eyes. I trust yours more when you've had sleep." "I sleep," Gendry said, which was only true because he could fall asleep standing up. "You made a crown," Jon said suddenly. "I made a crown," Gendry returned, as if they were agreeing on the weather. "It fits." "It pinches," Gendry said frankly. "If it didn't pinch, you'd shake your head and it would fall when you needed it to stay. It's meant to remind you of where the weight is." "You could have made it pretty." "I could have," Gendry said, with a little flare of humor in his eyes that made him look like a boy in an alley that had 2 ways out. "You could have chosen pretty. You didn't." "Will you make nails for the bridge Jaime is building?" Jon asked. "I'll make nails for anything that is honest," Gendry said, and went away with his strap knocking lightly against his leg like a tame snake. The city's texture thickened as the work went on. Men began to expect bread at certain hours and benches to be in their places and petitions to be heard until the light caught a certain angle in the hall. The watch began to find pride in being told by old women that their cloaks were clean. The harbor court's canvas became a landmark. Men told friends to meet them under the talk, and patient quarrels bloomed there like winter cabbages, tough and satisfying. The heart tree put out another leaf. Davos returned a second time with a ship that had taken on water and still outrun 2 smaller craft with bright paint and louder men. He brought with him a boy who had been sold 3 times since he was 5 and had the mathematical look in his eyes of a child who has learned precisely how much men think he is worth. Davos set the boy to counting rope, and he did it as if counting rope were counting years. In the keep yard, the boy put his cheek against the little tree's bark and then looked embarrassed when he realized anyone might have seen him and bared his teeth like a dog. Arya saw him and lifted her chin and bared her teeth back, and he laughed, surprised into it. One evening, as the moon was a broken bowl and the river a slick of pewter, the woman in the shawl came carrying something in her arms wrapped sloppily. She put it down on the bench by the little tree and unfolded it. It was a loaf of coarse bread, hot and smelling of everything good. "You're not the baker," she told Jon, who had come into the yard to stand alone for a moment and found he was not. "I know that, but it's a city's way to give thanks to hands that are nearby. You make sure the cook gets my thanks as well." "I will," Jon said, too moved by the modesty of it to do more than hold the warm weight. He tore the loaf and shared it with her there under the dark, and she told him a story about her husband as if the bread had bought the right to tell it. He did not try to fix the ruined parts of it. He listened until the story made its circle and lay down. A raven out of the west with damp wings brought a small note from Jaime. The words brief as a man breathes when working. "Bridge half laid," he wrote. learned the name of every stonemason on the East Bank. A boy lost his shoe in the mud, and we dug till we found it as if it were gold. I told them it is. Send more nails. And a postscript. Tell Brienne the blaze on the colt's face looks like a man's hand. Surprised me. When John gave the note to Brienne, she looked at it longer than a brief thing needed, and then said, quite simply, "Good," in a tone that could have been addressed to a horse or a man or a road. Under all of it, the city's older bones shifted. The alchemists sent no letters. They sent looks from windows that took in the yard where the heart tree was learning how to be a southern god, and they did not laugh when they meant to. The gold cloaks kept their walls and found that the sound of gossip at their elbows was softer now that mothers had other uses for their tongues. The red-sashed priest learned that a sermon in a street with no knives was harder work and better. He took off his sash once and went home and looked at it and laughed, and the sound did him good. Muriel began to favor a boy with a crooked tooth and 3 sisters who could not read. She taught him to read by making him read posted edicts aloud to men who pretended they could have read them alone. She made him read the harbor court sign twice so he could say penny without fear. In the north, Sansa wrote that a certain holdfast had not paid its tax because half the men there said that a king in the south had no place near their soup. She wrote that she had gone to the holdfast herself and stood in the gate and asked the women what they thought. And they had said that they thought a king who planted a tree where boys could see it might be a king they could send a penny to. She sent the pennies wrapped in cloth. She wrote that Bran had stopped a man from cutting down a sapling near the winter town with nothing but his voice and his smile and the placing of his body in the one spot where the axe would have to fall first on him if it fell at all. She wrote that she had told the man with the axe that if he cut the tree he would have to cut her next. The man had put the axe down and asked for work, and she had given it to him because sometimes you give the thing that saves a man from himself. When the first small caravan of Dorne's waterskins came north escorted by 3 spears with veils wrapped around their faces tighter than any cold, the city turned out to stare and then to laugh and clap hands and stand in line. The water in the skins tasted faintly of leather and sun and was sweeter than any wine to a man who had waited for it. The princess's envoy stood in the yard sipping, and her eyes smiled against her veil in a way that made Ned remember a girl he had once danced with before men forgot how to dance. "We will come," she said, "for your counsel. The prince will send his sister. She speaks kindly and carries a stick." "Good," Jon said. "We will not raise our voices. We will not lower our eyes. We will lay stones on the table and call them what they are." Arya came into the room then with a ribbon in her hand, a poor thing of frayed green tied round twice, and set it down beside the map of the stepstones. "The boy," she said by way of explanation. "The one with the crooked tooth. He had it tied to his wrist so he would not forget to run. He gave it to me when he learned he didn't have to run any longer. He said I should tie it somewhere so other boys could see it and know that a knot can be untied." Jon picked up the ribbon and considered where ribbon belongs in a king's room. He tied it around the handle of the narrow spade Ned had leaned in the corner after the planting. When Ned saw it, he nodded as if the thing had found its right home without needing to be told. There are days a king remembers because the sky makes a show of itself, and days he remembers because the work fits so well that his hands do not notice how steady they've become. There was a day like that just before rain came when the harbor court heard 14 quarrels and sent 14 men away with the sensation of having been held to account and kept entire. When the watch counted every loaf going into the old gate to the street where women with wide hips and scarred mouths made soup and told each other what their husbands had failed to do and what they had done well. When the heart tree shook off 3 drops of water and a child reached up to catch them and cried out as if he had caught coins from the air. When Davos taught a boy how to splice by making him tear his work apart 3 times until he could not bear to do it wrong again. When Eleanor announced in a voice that meant she did not care for objections that the crown would pay a small coin to any man or woman who could show that a sack of grain had been watered before sale. And 3 men came the next day with 3 wet sacks and a story that made a steward stammer. When Conlan's lamp burned steady and he wrote to Sam of candles and mice. When Brienne laughed once in a way that made the guard outside her door look at one another and decide this was a noise they would like to hear again. When Arya sat on a wall and watched the city and did not wish, for once, to be anywhere else. And in the Riverlands, there was a day when Jaime stood on the finished bridge with his hand on the nailhead Gendry had forged and felt, for the first time since he was a boy with a sword too long for his arm, that the thing he had made would hold when he left it. He thought of a woman in a blue cloak and a colt with a blaze like a hand and set his foot on the first stone of the far bank. The farmer who had wanted his ear watched him go and spat and then, after a moment, handed his younger son a crust of bread without taking the larger piece for himself. Night settles on cities like blankets on children. Some kicked off, some clutched. The Red Keep found a sleep it could share out in smaller portions than before. There were still screams in the dark sometimes. The world does not give up its old habits quickly. But there were fewer that went unanswered, and more that ended in water and a hand on a shoulder. The sapling stood, almost absurd in its persistence, and did what trees do without asking permission. It made a shape against the sky so the mind had something gentle to stand against. One night before the new council met, Ned sat with John and Arya in the room with maps. The lamp burned low on purpose and their words came out of longer spaces than speech usually likes. Ned told a story about a winter when he had been young, not to teach anything, but because his mouth needed to tell it to someone who would hold it for him. It was a story about a broken team between Winterfell and a holding that had run out of candles and hope at the same time. It had a crooked axle in it, and a boy who fell off the back of a sled and laughed even though his nose bled, and a woman who had worn her husband's boots until they were two different colors from the snow and the stove. He told how the men had not saved the day by being brave but by arriving, which is a different kind of heroic that stories do not love but life does. When he finished, Arya leaned her head on his shoulder like a little girl and John watched the flame and thought, most salvations are made of that. In the morning, before sun, a raven came with a scrap of parchment with a strip of blue thread attached and 4 words on it in a hand that had once known court and now knew wind. It lives, little brother. He read it twice and then did not smile but made his face into a thing the message could sit in without spilling. He put the scrap under the stone from the wolf's den near the last river and did not tell anyone for a day, so that he could have the fact to himself until he felt equal to sharing it. The council that gathered a week later under the great hanging nets in the hall had fewer banners and more people than any that room had seen in a generation. There were the lords and their ladies who knew their sons and their sons' tendencies, and there were smiths and a fishwife and the woman in the shawl and Miriel and the boy with the crooked tooth and 2 men who had learned not to shave coins and a priest with his sash folded up and a maester whose chain rattled more than necessary and a smuggler who stood with his hands behind his back like a scholar. There was a chair kept empty, a courtesy for a woman who had not come and might never, and its emptiness felt honest, not bitter. There were spears from Dorne leaning like water reeds along the wall, and there were men from White Harbor with salt printed on their gloves. There were words about Elia that did not make show and words about roads that would require sweat and coin and patience and words about the sea that remembered how quickly it takes insult. There were old men who spoke too long and found themselves paying a penny. There were young men who tried to speak and found they could, because no one laughed. John spoke last because it was right to let the room become itself first, and when he did, he said nothing that would find its way into a play or a song except by a poet's kind lies. He spoke of doors that must be made to fit their hinges and of stones measured twice. He spoke of law with bread baked into it. He spoke of Elia and set her name down gently, as if laying bread before a guest who had come far, and he named the house with her name and said what it would be and what it would not. He spoke of the stepstones and the ledger and said the crown would not allow irons on wrists that had only done the work of living. He spoke of water and wine and said the council would drink one and not the other while they worked. He spoke of taxes and grain and the price for a loaf and the punishment for selling a half as a whole, and he did not say the word mercy, but he made the word fill the room like a smell of something baking. When he finished, he did not ask for applause. He asked for names. Men said them, women too. The boy with the crooked tooth said his name as if it were new made. The woman in the shawl said hers as if she were testing whether it still belonged to her. Miriel did not say hers. She never would. She sat on a ventana and smiled her cat smile and bit an apple. When she saw Arya looking up at her, she raised the apple in mock salute and then tossed down the core expertly into the lap of the alchemist, who had thought to come and stand at the back and pretend to know no one. He yelped, then laughed, then stayed. The business of a reign is mostly such making, name by name, measure by measure, listening, hammering, and the silence between. The iron chair sat where it sat and glowered, and sometimes John sat in it because the spectacle of sovereignty still works on a certain kind of dull man in ways that save time. But he preferred the L, our chair, and the city came to prefer it too. Late that night, when the hall had emptied and the guards' voices had fallen to murmurs and the heart tree in the yard ticked softly with the sound of a night breeze moving its small leaves, John went to the window and stood with his palms on the sill. He heard the river and the distant slap of water at the pylons and the closer breath of his own men. Ned came to stand beside him, and for a long while they did the thing that had become more sacred to them than any prayer. They said nothing together. Then Ned said, "The work holds." "It does," John said. "It will be tested." "It will," John said. He looked down and saw a boy in the court below with his hands held out and a woman placing a loaf in them and a man stepping back so the boy could carry it. "We will not jump at shadows," he said. "We will not fear our own light." Ned put his hand briefly over his son's. His hand was warm and dry. "Morning will come," he said simply, "the oldest promise a father ever makes, and the one that matters most when he can keep it." It did. It came with clouds that held rain and then decided to keep it. It came with a hawker calling pears in a voice so musical men laughed to hear it and then bought pears to hear it again. It came with a raven's wing and a petition about a donkey and a merchant who had shifted his measure by the width of his thumb and a boy learning to splice a rope without cutting his hand and a glass candle that did not light and a priest who did not forget to pay his coin for the curb and a woman with a shawl and no knife near a tree. It came with Gendry's hinges working sweet and Eleanor's ledger sweeter and Davos's patience and Conlan's lamp and Brienne's boots and Arya's steps where the doors closed. It came with the quiet surety only slow labor can grant. That what you set in place, if you set it soundly, will bear weight when you are tired and will still be there when you wake. The realm learned to breathe. It did not yet sing. No one asked it to. There is a season for breath and a season for song. Jon Snow, who had learned breath on a wall of ice and song in a silence so deep it had almost killed him, set his hands to the day and let the city keep time with him, and wherever men tried to hear only the clink of coin, other men learned to listen for the far steadier sound of stone laid on stone, of a tree making leaf, of a boy saying his name aloud and discovering it held. Rain began without deciding to fall, a softening of the air that became beads on wood and then a fine brush across stone. It made the smells of the city spring nearer, roasted bones in broth, wet wool, oranges sliced in a kitchen where a woman laughed unexpectedly and then checked herself, river silt, pitch. Men adjusted hoods that were not quite waterproof. A dog shook itself and then shook again, unable to believe water could be so polite and so persistent. John liked such rain, cleaned without boasting. He stood for a moment under the arch that led from the inner yard to the kitchens and watched the drops string themselves from the sapling's leaves and fall in a rhythm that was almost a measure. The bark had taken to the earth with a steadiness he trusted. He held lightly in his mind a memory of Winterfell's godswood in a spring like this one, the red hand-shaped leaves gleaming like wet lacquer, the pool dark as secrets. The Red Keep had no pool yet. The earth under the tree held water and returned it to the air, the way men hold grief and release it in work if they have been taught. By the time the rain turned to a whisper, the Dornish envoy came, not as she had come before veiled and measured by another's question, but unveiled and measured only by herself. She wore pale linen under a tan cloak and carried the stick she had promised. It was not a weapon. It had the grace of a dancer's staff and the weight of a thing that had found many uses in a long life. Her hair was dark, threaded with sun, and her eyes held the desert's knowing. Joy and danger are the same animal, and a wise woman feeds both but does not let either sleep in the bed. They met in the small garden just off the outer gallery, where a fig tree in a pot pretended to understand northern patience. Ned stood with Jon, and Lady Eleanor attended too, not to meddle in honor but because money is the cousin of every pledge. "I am Arianne," she said without a title, and smiled with her whole mouth and not with her teeth. "It will save us minutes if I give you my name and not my father's." "I am Jon," he returned, and she inclined her head the precise amount any person reserves for another who has chosen to be simple without being foolish. "This is my father and my hand," he said, and something changed in her gaze for a breath, as if she had been shown a bird thought extinct and now living on a branch 2 yards away. You keep him, she said, and tapped her stick lightly on the flagstone. Good. The last king your city had could not keep his father. That was a poverty no treasury recovers from. She sat when he gestured, but not before walking the garden once, picking a leaf and crushing it to smell, putting her hand to the low wall and the damp in the stone, tapping the flagstones with her stick to hear the old echoes. When she sat, she folded her cloak behind her like another garment. You've sent us a house, she said, not as a compliment and not as a test. You've said it will be named for Elia. For Elia Martell, John said. I'll not eat her name. Her eyes sharpened with an old speed. Good, she said. Men have eaten it enough. What will be put under it? Bread alone, or bread and law? Will you let a woman with a bruised face and no man say her trouble aloud and be believed? That is a greater vow than coin can pay. Ned nodded, slow and absolute. We will make a small council within the house, he said. A woman will sit in each chair. The cook's knife will be too sharp to be used for anything but onions. A man who hurts a woman and comes near the house will be hurt by the law before he sees her door again. If a woman lies, the house will flog her with shame itself. We will forgive often. We will not be fools. Arian took that in like wine, tasting the tannin and the sweetness both. We will send coin, she said, and women with knowledge and hands that know where babies' heads should be when they come, and which boys must be taught to use knives for fish and not for conversation. And we will send a singer who knows Eliah's songs in the old way, without weeping. He will sing them to your women and to your men. If the men cannot bear it, he will sing them until they can. She drew from her cloak a rolled strip of white cloth, thin as a skin of water, and set it on the table. Ned's breath caught. It was a habit cloth from the Septon Sunspear where Elia had once sat and sewn and laughed and bled. Lay this under your first stone, Arian said, eyes steady. Not as magic, as memory. We will, John said. They walked then beyond the garden to the place the masons had marked beside the September of the Mother, where a low wall would cradle the house of Eliah's name. The city had gathered, but not in the way of a crowd that waited for spectacle. They had brought bread ends and flowers, bits of ribbon, a cup of water from Dorn's first skins, a coin saved twice, a handful of dry beans. The woman in the shawl stood near the front with her hands in her sleeves, so she could keep from clapping too soon. Muriel hung from a window ledge like an elegant bat. The red-sashed priest came and stood in the rain with his sash wrapped in brown cloth and said nothing. Brienne stood across the lane with 6 and did not look like steel. She looked like the door a room needs. Arian knelt and tapped the ground with her stick as if asking it if it might bear another vow. Ned laid the habit cloth in the wet earth with hands that steady themselves more when other men are watching, and John shaped his hands around the first stone and lowered it into place. His fingers came away muddy and the mud left streaks on the plain steel circlet he wore because it was right to wear it here. Arian's stick tapped the stone once. Rise, she said to the house that was not yet a wall, and the city breathed the word too, almost surprised at its own voice. Later, they went to a table with figs and water and a few olives and a plate of salt. Eleanor brought her ledger as if it were a friend, and Davos came with his palm still smelling of rope. Arian unrolled a map of wells on the Dornish marches, a web of lines and circles and notes, and the story of how water becomes politics in a dry land. She told them bluntly of the bribes one pays to make river rights move as quick as morning. She told them how to make such bribes honest by calling them by their public names. Labor, lime, the shaping of new stone. She asked, too, in the relaxed way of a person who expects to get what she requests if the people at the table are really who they say they are, for a thing that would have made most kings bristle. Do not write to the marcher lords over me, she said. If you want to know what Dorne will do for grain, you write to me. You will not like some of my answers. I will not like some of yours. It will be an honest quarrel. I will not be spoken to through men whose grandfathers stood on hills to see whether they could spit the farther into our sand. John met her gaze without flinching. We'll write to you, he said. And when we argue, we'll keep to the subject. She grinned, delighted. A king who knows what a subject is, she said. We're starting to be friends. When the Bravosi came, He came on cat feet and with a ledger that had been beaten with salt and wind and hands into a shape like an old man's back. He had the polite face of a clerk who has learned never to betray what his master thinks and the gall of a merchant who believes he is the true master. He wore gray and smelled faintly of cedar. "The Iron Bank remembers," he said as if reciting a prayer. "And the Iron Bank does not forgive." Lady Eleanor laced her fingers and leaned forward as if to show him she remembered other things. "The crown is not Cersei Lannister," she said at once, before he could unroll the debt like a sail. "We will not pay for her wildfire. We will pay for the grain and the iron and the rope and the men's wages whose names you have kept. You'll not be paid twice. You'll not be paid for interest you invented in a room when men were bleeding outside your wall." Conlon placed a lamp on the table and turned the wick up a finger width, as if to illuminate both the bank's arrogance and their own ledger's careful hand. Davos stood where he could see the door and the Bravosi's fingers. Ned stroked the rim of the table with his thumb, as if smoothing an old worry in wood. "The realm owes a vast sum," the Bravosi said. "We do not care whose hands stacked it." "I care," Jon said. "We'll pay what the realm owes, not what thieves owe. If you bring me a list of men who spent so that children could eat, they'll be paid. If you bring me a list of men who were paid to whisper into a tyrant's ear, they will go hungry. You may decide whether your account pleases your masters. I decide whether it pleases mine." "We are owed," said the man, and for the first time a little crack in his first polite mask showed the true face behind it. "Fear, because fear is what makes men good bookkeepers." "You are," Eleanor said suavely. "We'll anchor repayment to public receipts. We'll establish a tariff at the harbor court. 1 farthing on every contract settled under the canvas. The coin will go into a chest with 3 locks. 1 held by me, 1 by the master of ships, and 1 by a clerk of your choosing who will live in the city and learn to bake bread. We will remit quarterly. You'll send a woman to audit us, not a man." He started. "Why a woman?" "Because men in your city pretend they cannot see certain sums when they're put under their noses," Eleanor said, bored. "Women see what's in the pantry." Davos hid a grin in his beard. Conlon allowed himself a cough that was not a cough. Ned kept his face as a stone keeps its breath. There, but not fidgeting. "And you will write," Jon added, "that if the Iron Bank sends swords to collect, we'll stop the harbor court and pay no one for a season. Our merchants will come to you to borrow and will find your doors closed because they have allied themselves with a bank that seeks to starve children. They will not come back. We'll do all that politely because I prefer to be polite. Takes less time. But we'll do it." The Bravosi began to calculate the time it takes a large city to pause and the speed with which merchants change their shirts. He looked at Eleanor and saw a woman who had outlived 3 stewards and a husband and cooked barley for men who were not her kin. He looked at Davos and saw a man who knew every trick a banker had ever imagined on water. He looked at Ned and saw a man who would not blink while bad arithmetic was made good. He looked at Jon and saw a boy who had been a man before he grew a beard, and he sighed, not defeat, but the sound of a man who has had to accept a fact about his own set of choices. "We will send a woman," he said slowly, "and a clerk. He will eat bread. He will learn to say thank you to a cook," Eleanor said. "Otherwise he'll eat nothing but dry figs." The banksman smiled despite himself, as many men of numbers will when they meet another that has wrestled numbers down and won. He set his seal to a draft in Conlon's clean hand and bowed. "The Iron Bank remembers," he said again, but this time the words felt less like a threat and more like a proverb, useful and true. While kings haggled and ladies counted, the city continued to be a city. Arya climbed the gate tower by the muddy way at dawn and sat with her back against the parapet, listening to the footfalls that meant thieves and the ones that meant men carrying bread. She had learned long ago that a city teaches its own language to those willing to be quiet. A pair of gold cloaks below walked their beat with the easy slouch of men who no longer feared to be checked. She followed them for a stint, down into lanes where the roofs nearly met and the smell of old rags clung to the bricks. She watched them stop a woman with a bundle and ask her what she carried. The woman said, "Soap." And the older gold cloak wrinkled his nose and made a joke to his mate that would once have made both of them laugh and would have turned into a demand. A cake for the watch. The younger man looked suddenly and very vividly at Arya's eyes watching from shadow. His hand twitched toward his cap out of reflex. He cleared his throat and said to the woman, "Soap is good." He stepped aside. The older man caught himself and stilled. Later that day he came up to the harbor court and paid a penny to speak, and when he had the right to speak he said, "A man came through the old iron gate with a sack of flour. He was headed for Rat Cleft, and they've been selling watered flour. His sack was dry. I followed him and watched him sell. He didn't mix it. He'll have a stall under the awning if it rains." He coughed, as if to clear an old taste from his throat. The court wrote the stall's description in a margin. The woman with the bundle of soap walked by under the canvas and lifted her chin at the older gold cloak. She did not smile. She did not need to. In the Riverlands, the rain lingered and then went away, and Jaime Lannister learned the shape of a road through a man's knees. He learned which stonemasons would keep laying even courses when his back was turned. He learned which boys would steal nails for the joy of it and how to put them to work counting them instead. He walked with his glove off when he could so the men would see he was not hiding a hand that could be used for deceit. When men asked about old wrongs, he let them list them and did not argue. He said, "I did harm," and "I came to mend what can be mended." And sometimes a man spat in the mud and sometimes a man surprised himself and said, "Pass the mallet." He came to a small septry with a roof that leaked on the wrong side and a woman who ran it as if it were her own hearth, which it was. She looked at him and saw a man with a famous jaw and a tiredness she had only seen on men after a famine. She told him they needed lime and hands and someone to sing for the old women at night who were frightened of their own lungs. He sent for lime. He put his own men to carry. He sang the song he knew about a woman who loved an apple tree and regretted the tune's body turn halfway through and laughed and kept singing anyway, and the old women laughed with him and were not afraid when they coughed. He met Edmure Tully but not in a hall. He met him in a low field where a ditch had begun to eat a road. Edmure had his breeches rolled and his hair stuck to his temples and his mouth set in that stubborn shape that makes men both good and very difficult. He had a boy on his hip who chewed on his thumb and looked at Jaime as if considering whether to keep him. The men stood ankle-deep in water and measured the slope with their hands and cursed the past lord who had let the ditch be an afterthought. "You used to wear your hair longer," Edmure said after an hour, as if the same enemy had cut them both. "I used to wear a cloak like a bad idea," Jaime said dryly. "I don't miss either." "You cost me a lot," Edmure said presently, straight-faced. "I did," Jaime said. "I came to spend." Edmure nodded once, a small acknowledgement that he had expected a different answer and liked this one better. "Build the ditch deeper and lay stones in the bottom," he said. "I have a mason who likes to pretend he's in charge of the river. Make him think he is." He shifted the boy on his hip. "You'll not see songs made on this." "I've had songs," Jaime said. "They're cheap." Edmure's mouth flickered toward a grin. "This is dear," he said, and stepped off the bank into the ditch to start digging. Letters went back and forth like migrating birds. Small, persistent, season-making. Jaime wrote to Brienne infrequently. He wrote to the king to ask for more nails and a man's clever hand and sent back, once, a mitten knitted by a grateful old woman that would not fit anyone but a man who had lost something. John held it a moment and then laid it by the heart tree to take the smell of wet earth and the city and perhaps carry some comfort back to the road even if the wool never traveled. The stepstones answered not with a letter but with a ship, long, low, Tyroshi paint like a bruise, commanders who were too polite. They positioned themselves at the mouth of the Blackwater as if admiring the current, and Davos went out alone in a boat with one oarsman and a coil of rope and salt as confidence. "Good morning," said the Tyroshi captain, all spirals in his beard and turquoise rings. "We admire your river. We will escort your merchants, for a fee." "We like our escort to be named," Davos said. "We call it the Gold Cloaks on shore and our king at the quay. Fees are paid to men whose names and sums are posted under a canvas, not to men who keep their ledgers in their shoes." The captain smiled a professional smile. "We sell peace," he said. "We are very good at it." "You sell fear," Davos said. "I am very good at that. I tell men what happens if they buy it." They did not fight, a mercy not then. The Tyroshi ship drifted politely 2 days and then slid away. Davos knew it would tug on another rope elsewhere and wait to see if someone else fell. He tightened his watch, not with more men, with better habits. Signals along the wall, a sprit of orange peel in water casks to remind the nose of home. Pikes where pikes belong at first light. Lanterns shaded exactly so along the quays. He set a boy at a vantage and made him recite the method for counting masts. He walked the quay at night with a wool cap pulled down and let the city forget he was anyone a man would write a line about. A quieter fire flared where men did not see. The Alchemists' Guild shuttered their windows at odd hours. Conlon sent a boy he trusted with a bucket and told him to knock and say his mother needed lye and could he have a cup's worth for soap. The boy returned with the lye and a careful description of the number of vials he had seen stacked behind a screen and a man's hand stained with something that would not wash out. Arya took the door's new bar in her hand that evening and tested the way it slid in the track Gendry had made. It moved sweetly. She cracked it open and shut it twice, teaching her own body the door's sound, so that if it made the wrong one her bones would hear it before her ears did. The wrong sound came 2 nights later, not at the kitchen yard door, at the harbor court's canvas. A man moved too quickly with a pot meant to carry oil and not carry flame. He was nimble, but fear had made him less so than he imagined, and Arya saw how his shoulders tensed with a thought and then decided and tensed again. She did not let him make a third thought. She moved past 2 sleepy quarrelers bickering over the length of a dock and under the edge of the canvas and took the pot out of his hands and tipped it into the sand and stomped it twice and the sand inhaled with a soft sound. Thankful. Her hand came away singed. She did not notice. The man stared at her hand like a boy looks at a dog's jaws that have closed around his glove. He considered lying about what he had meant to do. He considered running. He looked at the pennies he had meant to be paid, and at the faces of the men who had been arguing and now were not, and he put his mouth into a shape men recognize when they have used their hands for the wrong thing and begin to cry. Brienne arrived and put a hand on his shoulder that weighed exactly as much as mercy, which is to say, enough to keep him from floating into his fear. "What did you mean to burn?" she asked without scorn. "I don't know," he said honestly, because he hadn't. He'd meant to burn something. That had been the pleasure of it. "You'll carry buckets at the river," she said, "and you'll tell me every man who paid you a coin, and I'll find him, and he'll carry with you." He nodded so hard she worried for his neck. "All right," he said, almost relieved to have found a wall. Gendry came later to look at the place where the sand had smoked and spat. He crouched and picked up a little clod of blackened oil and crushed it between finger and thumb. "We should post a list of what's forbidden within the walls," he said without looking up. "Not because men read, because boys do." Jon wrote it with Conlon. No bundles of pitch inside the second gate. No oil above a certain measure within the walls unless the harbor court has stamped the jar with a seal. No torches within a man's height of a door where children sleep. No open flame under canvas except where the harbor court sets the stones. No keeping of wildfire residue. No experiments without a written witness and a bucket. They posted it at each gate in a hand large enough that boys could read it to their fathers and say the word "forbidden" with relish and argue about the measure and proudly fetch the harbor court stamp. That afternoon, a thin man with a neat beard and the particular humility of a person who has been forced to be precise came to the court with a jar and a stamp and asked for permission to keep oil for soap making. He presented his measure. A stick with marks at inches burned in, and their clerk had him read the list aloud and then stamped his jar. He left with his permission like a little prize. The alchemists sent no one. They kept their jars in the dark. Conlon made a note to set a boy to counting their candles by night. Ned crossed the yard after dusk and found Jon leaning with both hands on the rim of the rain barrel, his reflection a small blur in the water. "You'll make 100 small rules and men will break them," he said mildly. "They'll say a king makes too many rules and that's why they break them." "I know," Jon said. "I'll make them anyway. When a woman picks up a jar of oil that holds a stamp, she'll know we were thinking about her." Not about a man with a clever hand in a tower. Ned grunted his harsh little assent. You've a clever hand, he said after unexpected. You use it to make a simple shape. John did not answer to a compliment. He never had. He straightened and shook his wet fingers and watched the droplets fall back into the barrel with a sound like a very fine rain. On a gray morning like stirred ash, Sansa wrote of wolves. They had come near the winter town one night, not hunting, moving as a family moves when the house grows smaller and the night grows larger. Ghost was not named, but John read him in the spaces. The way the goats had not bleated and the men had not reached for spears. The way a boy had gone very still and put his hand down and felt a breath as cold as snow and calm as a well. She wrote that Bran had gone into the Godswood and come out with a strip of white moss and a red berry and said, "We will plant this." And they had planted it near the gate where men could see it on their way to piss and to plow and to court. She wrote that a girl with frostbitten ears had begun to laugh again. She wrote when, not how. John put the letter down and walked to the little tree and stood with his palm flat to the bark. And he did not ask for anything. He thanked without words. He had learned that from men with few teeth and much steadiness. Before the council day, Conlon climbed the tower and blew dust off a leather that had not been unrolled since the day when the last king had locked himself inside and shouted at candles. It was an old charter that named how men were to sit in a hall when they meant to argue without spilling blood. It set out the order in which a baker might speak and a lord must wait, and how many candles might be burned and how many pennies a loudmouth owed beyond the first. Conlon brought it down under his arm and slapped it flat with a satisfaction that had nothing to do with revenge and everything to do with continuity. "We will not pretend we invented good manners," he said. "We will practice them." The council day came again, and this time the hall smelled of figs more than of men. Arianne came back with her stick and 3 older women with wrists like whips and a boy who wrote right to left and left to right with equal grace and took the minutes without dropping an E. She sat near the fishwife and near Lady Eleanor and near Muriel, who had appeared on a bench with the expression of a cat who has decided not to leave a room. Edmure sent a man from the Riverlands with maps of flood and dust. White Harbor sent a woman who could count grains of wheat falling from a hole in the bottom of a sack and swear aloud at a man who had cut the hole, and then apologize to his wife and send her bread. The Iron Bank's clerk sat at the back with a loaf on his lap as if he were guarding it. Davos stood and did not sit. Men like him do not like chairs in rooms where too many words collect. Brienne sat with her gloves off. Arya stood against a post and let the eyes pass over her and remember her and forget her at once. They spoke about the House of Elia and set a table for a next season there, and they spoke about the Stepstones and agreed that if the Triarchy wished to test a new king they would find themselves tested by old women's tongues at every pier, and they spoke about grain and the price for bread and tears for those who could not pay and those who could and would not. They spoke of wells and ditches and the river when it runs too broad. They spoke of the alchemists and a letter that would be sent to them asking for a list of acceptable practices within the walls and offering them a workshop by the river if they wished to boil oils away from children's hair. They spoke of the danger of pretending all oddness is a threat and the greater danger of pretending none of it is. They spoke of men's oaths and how to make them stick. Not by fear, but by 3 different honest reasons for a man to keep one. "My father used to hang thieves," an old lord said. He did not say it proudly, but he said it as if it were a kind of virtue unappreciated now. "My father used to mend harness," a woman said. "He said a strap that breaks a second time is the horse's death, so you don't mend badly." "Bad mending is theft," said Eleanor, neat, finishing the weaving. "Of trust." "Of time," said Arianne. "Of children," said the fishwife, and the room breathed in at the way she said the last word. John spoke at the end as he had before, and when he laid down his voice the hall felt full enough. They did not cheer. They did not need to. Men came forward to offer names and coin and work and requests and blame. A boy with a crooked tooth hugged the post and looked at Arya without asking for praise and got it in a sideways tilt of her head anyway. That night a candle lit of its own in the rookery, and Conlon put a bucket beside it and did not tell anyone until morning. He watched the flame with the curiosity of a man who has learned to survive by not believing himself too soon. It burned green and steadied. No language, no whispers, only light. He told Sam through a raven, "We saw." We did not touch. We did not ask. Write what you see and do not let the light make you its fool. The raven went with a beat of wings and a shake of rain. Conlon slept like a man who has tied his own hands to the bedpost, so he cannot reach for a thing best left alone. On the river road, Jamie woke with his head full of a dream in which a woman laughed and a Colt's blaze looked like a hand, and then a man with a sack over his head tried to run and could not. He went out into a morning that had been rinsed. A man came up with a handout for money and a story that had a hole in it. Jamie gave him work and pointed to the hole, and the man laughed and confessed and did the work twice as fast as any other because he had been seen. A girl brought him plums in a basket as if he were a septri. He ate one and gave the rest to his men. He wrote at evening with his bad hand and his good hand both. To Brienne, you were right about the colt. He will be daring and break things and be forgiven. To the king, send men who know how to set stones in winter because I do not trust this dirt. Send nails. Send, if you can, a pot of something from your cook that tastes of home. It was not a soldier's ask, and John sent the pot. Days slid into one another like clean plates stacked, and the city began to carry its own weight with different muscles. The harbor court clerk found his hand cramping less. His script grew a little sloppier and more alive. The gold cloaks began to arrange bets on which Loudmouth would have to pay the penny first, and then stopped betting when the Loudmouth learned to close his mouth and made them poorer. The red-sashed priest learned a new way to preach. Quiet and close and in words that did not turn boys' eyes into coins. Lady Eleanor posted a list of names of men who defaulted on measures at the gate and wrote beneath it in a smaller hand, "Bring this to me and we will speak." 3 men came. She employed one and sent the other 2 to haul chain and recite their sins to Muriel, who handed each an apple core after. Late, in the last light of a day that had not required a sword, Arian stood at the low wall of the kitchen yard and watched the sapling. She tapped her stick lightly against the stone as if encouraging it to consider growth. John came out with a crust in his hand and tore it absent-mindedly and scattered crumbs, and then remembered that crumbs bring rats and stopped. She saw the tug in him, the reflex of giving and the reflex of guarding, and smiled. "You are learning my land without stepping on it," she said. "I am still stepping," he answered, "only more carefully." "Good," she said. She shifted the stick to her left and sighed with a satisfaction that had no coyness in it. "We are not done," she added. "We will not be done. That is disappointing, and it is very fine." He looked toward the river. "Davos thinks the Triarchy will try a new trick." "They will," Arian said. "Men who live by tolls cannot bear new bridges. But you have a man in the Riverlands building a bridge. It will make a music the Stepstones cannot hear. They will hear other music soon, the clatter of your harbor court pen, the clack of your watchman's pike, the counting of a boy with a crooked tooth. It will annoy them greatly." He laughed with real ease. "You think a boy's counting can annoy a triarch?" he asked, surprised into delight by the audacity of it. Arian's smile went sideways, a desert fox at dusk. "My king," she said, the words half a bow, half a jest, all true. "A boy counting out loud has undone more empires than any fleet." He slept that night with the window unlatched and the smell of rain coming in like a story a mother tells twice on purpose. He dreamt, not of crypts, but of the yard, of the sapling and the plank and the 2 boys who watched it, and of a woman biting a boy's hand so his sons would have hands to work with 20 years hence. He woke with a soft ache at the base of his throat where tears wanted to find a way out and found his eyes dry. He drank water and went to work. In the week that followed, letters filled his table like a good harvest. Sansa's careful hand asked for rope, and rope was sent. Edmure's man wrote that a flood had been abetted with laughter and curses and lime. The Iron Bank's clerk wrote that he had learned to like barley soup and that he had been called son by a cook and had nearly wept. Davos wrote 3 words inside the margin of a map, "This cove empty," and then below it 2 others, "This one not," and John followed the ink with his fingertip. Conlon wrote of a candle that would not light no matter how he wished it, and of a mouse that had returned to the rookery with a grain of wheat for a mate, which told him that men were feeding mice somewhere near the maester's stairs. He set a trap that caught a boy's fingers before it caught a mouse's, and he taught the boy to set a trap that catches mice without catching men. Brienne wrote nothing. She sent reports. Arya sent no fair copies at all and brought him names by mouth, which is the safer way to hand a man something that matters. One afternoon, as the city was ticking along with the confidence of a repaired clock, a procession of men with very clean shoes and expressions like rainwater arrived at the gate. They were the alchemists, carrying nothing visible but their irritation. Their gloves hid stains that had taken the skin's top layer with them. They had received the letter. They had come to display their offended dignity. Jon met them in the yard because the yard was where new things stayed safe. Brienne stood near, but not near enough to make the meeting a contest. The man at their front had a voice like dry parchment rubbed together. "We have served cities when kings were children and when they were gone," he said. "We have lit fires no one else could light and doused fires no one else could put out. We have made perfumes that turned soldiers into men who remembered their wives. And you made wildfire," Jon said mildly, "and you gave it to a woman who would have burned children in their beds. We will not argue that. We will say, boil oils by the river. Bring me a list of experiments you wish to attempt and keep the doors open when you attempt them. Let women choose soap before men choose mystery in places where children walk. If that wounds your dignity, I'll dress the wound." The man looked for a floorboard to stamp and found only stone. He looked to Conlon for an ally and found a scholar who had learned to love plain sense. He looked to Arianne for a grin and found a woman whose stick lay across her knees like a knife she would not use unless invited. He looked to Lady Eleanor and saw a ledger that weighed a kind of justice he had never thought to count. He sighed with a theatricality he had not meant to use. "We will boil outside," he said, as if saying a charm. "We will write our lists. You will invite mothers to stand at your door," Eleanor added sweetly. His eyes flashed, and then he smiled without meaning to. "We will invite mothers," he said, stunned by the idea and already imagining how it might help the work. Mothers have hands that know when a boil is boiling. As they left, Arya slipped their last man a little paper with the word soap written in a child's hand by the crooked-toothed boy. The man tucked it into his sleeve without looking and would find it there that night and smile and be angry he had smiled and change nothing and change everything later without noticing. The city made a habit of laying stones. It made a habit of naming aloud. It made a habit of letting boys count. Davos made a habit of looking at the horizon and not letting fear get into his eyes. Jon made a habit of saying, "We will do it," only when he meant to do it within the week. Ned made a habit of walking with his hood up and listening to men who did not know they were being heard. Brienne made a habit of sending a man who had erred to speak to the woman in the shawl before he came to her, so that he learned to fear not the lash but his own reflection in a mother's eye. Conlon made a habit of making tea and not talking about candles. Lady Eleanor made a habit of paying the watch on time down to the last copper and posting the list of pay where wives could see it. Arya made a habit of being where doors closed. Arianne made a habit of coming into the yard without letting the guards announce her. One evening, when the sky's color could not decide whether to be slate or wine, the woman in the shawl came up the steps with a bundle and set it on the bench near the little tree. "For the house," she said to Jon, who had come out because he had learned to come out when he heard her steps. He unfolded the cloth and found a baby inside. She slapped his hand lightly when he reached his finger toward the child's cheek, as if he were still a boy. "Not yours," she said. "Not anyone's. Everyone's. Her mother died with her hands clean. She'll suck from any breast until she knows which one is hers. I've told the house to make room. I brought her here first so your tree will know her name. I haven't chosen it yet." Jon nodded, throat thick. "We'll let the tree choose," he said. "Nonsense," she retorted gently. "Trees choose slow. Babies need names quick." She eyed the leaf and the way it moved. "But we'll let it help." The baby hiccuped and made a patient fish mouth. The sapling moved with the barely there breeze. A drop gathered and fell and struck the cloth. "Rain," the woman observed. "Good." She lifted the baby and tucked her back like a loaf under her arm and went away in her efficient stride, already making a list of who in the house had milk to spare and who needed an errand to make her stand tall. John sat with his elbows on his knees and his hands clasped and watched the place where the drop had darkened the cloth as if it were a seal. Ned sat beside him and did not speak until the silence had finished what it had come to do. "What will you call her?" Ned asked finally, knowing full well the woman would name the child. "What she'll be called is what matters," John said. "She'll be called Safe." ESPO. Co the last word as if testing it on his tongue. He found he liked the flavor. The night turned with the city. Beyond the walls, ships shifted. Far away on a low island that churned out of a patient sea, men cursed because their scheme had been noticed by the wrong person too early. They would make a poorer scheme in response and think it better because it would be meaner. On the river, a boat with a lantern moved under the shadow of an arch and paused and then moved again. On a farm beyond the Lion Gate, where the war had forgotten to finish its work, a man put his hand on his wife's belly and said nothing and felt kicked for his trouble and laughed. In Winterfell, a woman read a letter and put it down and stood and went to a window and looked south and said one word under her breath that no one heard, and it was the name of her father. And in a small room with a window that took a square of the river and made it into a neat picture, John wrote in his blunt hand, "There is bread enough. There will be more. The place for sleep is ready." He did not address the letter. He weighed it with the stone from the wolf's den and let it sit and did not promise himself anything more than to breathe and to begin again in the morning with the small work. Listen, measure, hammer, forgive, enforce, plant. He had never thought power would feel like this. A constant leaning, a weight comforting and frightening both. A series of decisions that made him reach for his father's breath in his ear and his sister's gaze when she knew in Arya's quickness and Davos's patience and Brienne's implacable middle. He did not think of songs. He thought of a bar sliding sweet in a hinge and a tree putting out a leaf and a boy reading a list aloud to his father who pretended he could have read it without a boy. Morning returned as promised. It did not ask thanks. It took the thanks it was given and laid them on the city like quiet light. The heart tree stood its small ground, stubborn and unafraid, and the men and women around it learned that in a place where swords had once been the way to make a point, other things could point too. A pen, a hand, a look, a loaf, a line written in chalk under a canvas that said, "This is the price for grain. Don't steal what feeds us." A stick tapped twice on a stone by a woman whose land had burned a man's name and was learning to sing it again. A father's hand covering a son's for a breath, saying nothing. A king's palm left flat upon a small trunk, not asking favor, only lending warmth. On a day when wind out of the bay cut sharper and the gulls hung flatter, a raven came in with a ribbon of blue thread about its leg and a scrap of parchment tied in a not only sailor's use. Conlon undid it carefully and saw 4 words and a 5th scratched as if added later by a hand that had paused. "It lives. Little brother. Wait." He brought it down and laid it beside the stone from the wolf's den. John read and did not read again. He put his hand on the stone and removed it and left the letter under it and did not move the stone the rest of the day because sometimes a man must make a ritual to hold the weight of what cannot yet be named. He went out into the rain and let it stipple his hair and his lashes. He crossed the yard and stood under the fig in the pot that still thought itself an ambassador. He stood a while longer under the heart tree. He said nothing. He thought of a dragon sleeping. He thought of a woman's hand that had once burned and now wrote in an honest pain. He thought of a city that must be made ready for any creature that comes. Man, sorrow, luck, a ship, forgiveness, by making it ready for babies and for bread. He went back to work. He would be there when the door opened, whether it swung wide or only a hand's width. He would be there when the knock came, whether it was a child's or a fleet's. He had learned the hinge he had made. It moved sweet when moved slowly, and it did not squeal when moved fast. On the long road through the riverlands, Jaime touched the nailhead Gendry had set and placed his palm on the stone that led to the far bank and then stepped down. He felt each pebble through his boot leather. He took off his glove for a silly reason, to feel the rain. He realized too late he was smiling. He let the rain have his face. He looked east and west and saw nothing dramatic. Only fields and a ditch, a cart with a broken wheel and a woman who had learned to mend her own wheel and would be paid for it tomorrow by a king who counted women. He laughed at himself, a kind sound that boys turned toward and did not flinch. He put his glove back on, and the world went on in its honest way, which is the way that saves men when they remember to love it. The third morning after the rain cleared, the stonecutter laid his line along the chalk Ned had snapped on the ground and tapped 3 times to ask the earth if she meant to be patient. The house rose by increments, the way any honest thing rises. Foundation rock carried on shoulders that knew the measure of a full day's fatigue. Mortar mixed to a recipe older than songs. Corners checked by a plumb held still even when a wind came. Women came by to watch and offered counsel in the form of cups of water set down close to hands at the moment hands most needed them. A whittled board became the first bench, put against the half-wall to be tried by weight, and when a mother tested it with a child on her lap and the board did not creak, her face changed in a small way that men who do not look at women miss their whole lives. Arian arrived before noon with her stick and 3 women, whose palms had that smoothness that comes from hot water and the roughness that comes from holding other women steady while pain does her work. They wore cotton dyed the pale brown of sand after a cloudburst and carried 2 bundles each. Cloth and pots, herbs and a ledger, things that make a house into a place where women are meant to live. She walked the perimeter twice, tapping the courses laid down, and nodded to the stonecutter once like a fellow craftsperson who approves the cut. "Your benches will face the door," she instructed Lady Eleanor, who had come down from the accounts tower with a string around her finger so she would not forget to speak to the tarman. "Women like to see the street. It makes them braver. And put a window at the back where a woman can sit with her back to a wall and still watch her children. Bad men think women look at nothing. We will prove them fools." Eleanor smiled without amusement. "I've been proving that for 30 years, she said. "Now I'll do it with a ledger." A boy with crooked teeth and a ribbon tied neatly to his wrist stood near the corner holding a slate. He had been sent to copy down the names of women who came to help, not so a king could read them later, so that when bread came it went to hands that had earned it. Muriel leaned in a doorway with her apple. Where do they come from? Those apples of hers, no one could say, and watched the boy's neat grit with the cat's pride that likes a new furniture for her room. The red-sashed priest stood in the rain that still hung soft in the air and did not call down fire. He bowed shallowly to Arian when her glance fell on him, and she allowed him the space a woman allows a man who has learned to keep his blade sheathed when he stands inside a city. They laid the habit cloth beneath the first doorstone at Arian's gesture, an old square of white linen that had been smoothed, not bleached by women's hands. Ned set it in place with his palm and then lifted his hand and set it again because his heart asked for that extra second's reverence. John set the stone above it with both hands and felt his back speak to him about work done with care, and the city around them exhaled as a person does when a child's name is finally spoken in a room and silence can go back to being restful. Far from the wall's new line, the Iron Banks woman arrived with her case. She came on a gray day in a gray robe that did not pretend to be poor and did not apologize for that. She had a mouth shaped by the courtesy of clerks and the necessity of telling men they have counted wrong, and her hair was braided close in a pattern that kept it out of ink. She introduced herself in syllables as precise as coin stacked, Vara no Osirin. She bowed exactly as deep to Lady Eleanor as she did to the king. Eleanor took her to the harbor court first. "If you mean to see where the realm's coin changes hands," she said, "you will need your hem splashed with fish water. Come." Vara watched 2 men quarrel over the price of pepper and watched Davos set a measure on the table that had been checked by 3 different shapes of hands. Northman, Summerman, boy, and watched the men accept that measure as if it were their own mother's spoon. She listened to a loud man pay his penny, then sit down and speak softly, and she watched a woman with a scar across her lip carry a chain with the harbor court stamp to a stall and seal a jar of oil for soap. She smiled at the stamp, a small honest pleasure, and when Eleanor turned to catch it, the Bravosi woman did not pretend not to be caught. "We will remit quarterly," Eleanor said later in the ledger room, where the windows faced the river and the smell of wet rope came in like a guest who knows where the bread is kept. "You will count with me. When they are wrong, you will tell me. When they are right, you will tell me louder. If a man is found to be changing weights under the canvas, he will be off the canvas for a season. If he does it again, he will be off the river. If the Iron Bank makes a face at that, it can make that face in Bravos. Vara inclined her head. "The Iron Bank does not make faces," she said primly. "Its men do." She tilted her own face toward the open ledger. "I do not like men who change measures. I was hungry once because a man changed measures. He did not change them again." She placed a coin, very small and almost too light, on the corner of Eleanor's page. "A marker," she explained. "We place it on sums we mean to remember." Eleanor placed a pebble beside it, the color of river silt. "We use these," she said. "Between the two of them, the world may be all right." On the water, Davos rowed a boat out under a sky that was the underside of a gull. He had arranged a meeting with a captain of the Summer Isles, a woman with a woman's name that the summer tongue carried like a sail, and that he tried 3 times and then gave up being clever about and called her captain. Her ship glowed like a cut of dark wood polished by many hands, and her crew sang low, their rhythm making the ropes speak to one another. She had come not for spectacle, but because letters had been sent with the courtesy of equals, and because the stepstones annoyed her as a pebble in a shoe does. "We do not pay men who make their living by stopping men," she told Davos, eyes amused and implacable. "We do not like men who make their living by stopping women. We will escort your grain if we are paid in pepper and courtesy, and if you agree to send a boy to us to learn to beat time on a skin." "A boy with a crooked tooth and 3 sisters," Davos said without thought, and then made a face at himself. "Or another, if his mother keeps him." The captain laughed, delighted at a man whose mind had boys in it at such a negotiation. "Send us one with good ears," she said. "We will return him with better hands." They drew up their agreement under the canvas while the harbor court was idle in the heat of patience. Vara wrote it in a clerk's neat hand, and Eleanor ran a finger down the totals and the places where men tend to cheat. They set the sum low enough to be honest and high enough that the summer woman would not go away dissatisfied. They stamped it with the court's mark and with a little wax seal that smelled faintly of cinnamon from the captain's box. The river held the reflection of the ship for a moment as if it had a memory, then let it go. When word went down the quay that the Summer Isles' long oars would run beside White Harbor's high-bellied grain ships, and that a woman without a sash would be paid more for a song than a man with a painted beard would be paid for a boast, the Tyroshi painted ship that had peered politely into the Blackwater slid off as if insulted. Davos watched it through a pin made by squinting and let his mouth not smile, because the sea keeps score in different ink than men do, and a man does not like to think he has gotten the better of it. He went back to counting and to teaching boys to coil rope until their mothers had to make them stop. Jaime Lannister learned, in a fall field that smelt of green rot and hope both, how to settle a feud that had been eating up men's mornings for years. It had begun, as these things do, with a boundary stone shifted by a flood and a mule that had learned to walk around a private path. It had become 2 villages leaning out of their soft windows to insult each other's grandfathers. He set a line of rocks along the ditch and stood with his false hand on his hip and his living hand on his belt and said, "The flood moved what was never yours. You can argue with the flood, but it will not answer. Do you want to argue with a flood? Or do you want to move stones with me and then go home?" They moved stones. He moved them like a man who had been forced to learn which end of a day weighs more. When it was done, a woman with flour on her sleeve brought him a hard crust she had saved, and he ate it as if it were gold and then gave the last bite to the boy beside her, and the boy laughed and then tried not to because his father had told him not to forgive too easily. Jaime did not ask forgiveness. He asked for the next ditch. At the Septri, the roof stopped weeping. At the mill, the wheel turned without shame. At the bridge, the nails did their quiet work. At evening, by a small fire, he unrolled a bit of leather and wrote to the Lord Commander under Brienne's formal title, and then under her name, and then drew a line through both and wrote nothing, because letters cannot carry all that men learn to say to each other, and because he had learned to keep a handful of words in the pocket only his own hand could reach. Arya slipped along edges where men had never learned to notice their own elbows. Miriel taught her which panes of glass were best for hearing, and which doors are useless to stand behind because men lean on them. In the counting house near the hook, called that because a man can hang a whole life on it, they watched a man who wore Tyroshi silk under a black cloak. He counted slowly, deliberately, like a man counting delays. He had 3 boys running for him and taught them to keep the ink on their fingers when they went home so their fathers would think them important. He visited the house where the scarred man with the W had weighed ash, and he put his hand on the doorpost the way a man marks a building he would like to own. They came to him not through a wall but through his pride. Arya asked him for advice on a matter beneath him, and he could not resist giving it because a man who tells a woman how to tie a purse is a man who later believes he untied it. He came to the harbor court to demand a seat and paid his penny with a flourish so large, he thought it hid the fact that his coin was shaved at the rim. Eleanor caught it in midair with 2 fingers and set it on the table, and it made a smaller sound than it should have, and the court laughed and wrote his name on a list that brought no honor, and a handful of mothers came to stare when the list was posted. He reddened and called it a mistake. He paid the fine in labor, and the labor was not hard, only long. He stirred soap under a mother's instruction and did not meet her eyes even once. The scarred man with the W went to the riverbank with him, and if he lifted his head sometimes and felt that breathing was easier now that his arms had something reasonable to do, neither man remarked on the difference between what they had been made to carry and what they were carrying. A raven arrived with a collar of crusted salt on its legs. It came to Ned where he sat with a boy learning his letters on a bench by the kitchen. The boy read the outside aloud, to King's Landing from Fair Isle by way of Harlaw, and looked up, proud to have made sense of that much coastline. Ned broke the seal and found a letter from a woman he had danced with once when his hair had not yet known gray. Yara Greyjoy wrote that fish were plentiful if men could keep from stealing nets from the next boat. She wrote that she had taught 3 captains to say the word tariff without spitting. She wrote that she would send dried fish and 3 fast ships for the Stepstone's trouble if she was paid in iron. That is, an agreement written, posted, and kept. She did not want to be friend to a king. She wanted a schedule and a line of coin in a ledger and to see, at a distance, a city that kept its word. John sent back a letter and a piece of rope exactly as long as his honor. Long enough to tie a ship, not long enough to hang a man. He agreed to a levy on fish sold inside the King's Market, a levy that would pay the Iron Islands for 3 months of escort where the Summer Isles could not reach because of wind, and he wrote that if any Greyjoy man took a single eel from a poor woman's basket without paying, he would find his ship tied at the gate until he had mended nets at the riverbank until all the mothers who had come to watch forgave him, a punishment that terrified no Ironborn and alarmed them more than any lash. Yara's reply came back with a fish scale stuck to the wax. Done. I will send men with eyes and ears, not with appetites. She added in smaller hand, tell Gendry to send nails for Stormwood. He makes them true. On the day the house opened its door, the smell of fresh scrubbed plank and bread rose under the lintel. Women had hung cloths along the walls, dyed with onion skin to a warm gold, red with crushed matter that a boy's hand had refused to release until the dye mistress had put her mouth close to his ear and said, "It looks like the things we keep alive." Arianne stood with her stick across her knees in a chair that would be sat in by a woman 3 times as old as she was. She had borrowed it for the opening and would return it with a pot of figs. Eleanor stood near the back with a ledger and a soft stick of charcoal and wrote the first name under the word bread and the second name under the word bed and the third under work. The woman in the shawl came with her baby, a girl now named Alara. She decided finally after the rain, because the name had the shape of a bell in it, and raised the child up toward the door lintel and thumped her heel very gently against the wood. "There," she said. "You're taller now." The girl hiccuped with grave dignity and then fell asleep. A boy came too, barefoot, not the crooked-toothed boy, another, with a thinness that made Eleanor's hand tighten. He asked in a voice too flat for his years whether his mother could sleep and whether a man would be waiting to drag her by her hair down the steps in the morning. "No," said Brienne, who stood like a good pillar under the eaves. The boy looked up at her and measured whether she meant it and decided she did. His shoulders settled a finger width. He watched his mother sit on a bench and a woman with a braided crown of hair tie her cuts and tell her what spices make bruises turn the right yellow while they heal. He went to the door and watched, and when he saw 3 men step into the lane and look toward the house and then away, because their old habits had learned a new fear, he revised his world 1 fraction and decided to go to sleep too. They did not speak of Elia in Longfra.
Si.
Arianne read out a short line, written by a man who had loved Elia and loved words, and then she set the paper down and said the name as if she were passing bread. Conlon climbed the step and said that a house was a book a city could read. Ned stood and did not try to add more because he understood that his saying less made the space for women to say the necessary things. John set his palm to the doorpost when no one was watching and thought of a red-lacquered leaf in rain and a woman who had been made into a story. He thought, not on my watch. He did not think about whether he had the right. He thought about the door. Sam wrote with a steadier hand and a more careful caution about the glass candle that had burned green for precisely the length of one prayer and then gone out as if a hand had shut a lid. He described, in lines tidy as floorboards, his decision to keep sand at its foot and the old habit the rookery had of listing which birds would be fed first if feed grew short. He sent a small folded list of habits. Wash hands before touching meat, wash hands after, hang clothes apart, do not sleep 3 to a bed when the weather turns, boil water when a cough spreads through a lane. Conlon held the list with reverence and put it into Eleanor's ledger and into Brienne's routines and onto a board at the harbor court so that a boy reading a price could read a habit and take it home like a secret. Manderley's next ship made a spectacle the quay did not need but loved anyway. A hoist rigged from a whaler's old mast and a wheel that turned with the sickening beauty of machinery built by men who enjoy their work. It lifted bundles of grain out of the hold like a mother lifting asleep children and set them down gently on the quay. Davos ran his palm over the iron teeth and muttered that if they did not keep the hoist greased it would bite. The white harbor woman with salt printed on her glove nodded gravely and set a boy to oiling, and the boy set another to watching him oil, and when they were done their hands smelled like a meal. Gendry was found under the hoist counting nails. He had made a rack to count by that would have embarrassed a master of coin. Pegs shaved smooth, numbers notched. He looked up at John and wiped his brow with the wrist of his glove, not with the glove itself, because he knew what ruin to a hinge a little grit can do. Stormwood doesn't behave, he said without greeting. It swells and it bites and it likes to shift just when you think you've bent it. We should teach the carpenters to talk to it. We will, John said, and we'll pay them to listen. Yara's first ship slid in with oars lifted in salute to no one in particular. The men on the benches did not sing, their mouths were not taught for it, but they kept their beat with a discipline that a city could count on. The captain, a severe woman with a scar that had taught her to laugh lower, came ashore with a fish tied at her belt. She handed the fish to the harbor court clerk, who blinked and then laughed and hung it on a hook under the canvas, where it swung like a new kind of bell. If any of mine take without paying, she told Brienne bluntly, I'll cut his braid and make him watch me throw it into your river. That hurts more than a lash. Good, Brienne said, and went back to her lists. The two women measured one another with quick, exact glances. That work done, they went to inspecting ropes. By degrees, and because men insisted on trying the door, Arya found the thread that tied the Tyroshi captain's polite retreat to a counting house in a lane that smelled of fennel and stale wine. It was not a clever thread. It was a purse dropped on purpose for a boy to find, with a coin large enough to bring a message and a note inside written in the slanted style of men who are used to scribbling while moving. She took the coin and the note and the boy's hand and returned all three to the harbor court. The coin was shaved at the rim and Eleanor's face sharpened like a whetted blade. The note named three things: a shipment, a night, and a phrase that would open a door in a cellar. The shipment was oil. The phrase was a jest about a green god's piss. The night was tomorrow. They set the guard for a quiet thing, not a raid. They let men bring their jars down and held the door open and made them explain, right away and without anyone raised his voice, why their jars did not carry a stamp. They stamped what could be stamped and salted what could not. No one was taken to a dungeon. The men were watched as they carried their salted ruin back to a place where their employers would insist on an account. Information was a more useful arm than a cudgel. Within a week, the Tyroshi counting house shuttered its windows and the scarred man with the W came and asked if there was work and was told yes. And he cried out once in the privacy of a shed and then began to carry. The alchemists simmered their oils by the river with doors open and the harbor court stamp on each jar. Mothers came to watch as required, and some of them stayed because they began to love the color a clean soap makes when you cut it. The guild, which had entered the yard with offended faces, discovered that a woman who has soothed a crying child has more patience for a man's experiment than any apprentice, and their smiles, when they remembered them, were almost shy. At Winterfell, Sansa took off her glove and put her hand to the bark of the heart tree and told Bran the city had planted a child's house. Bran smiled in that sideways manner that makes a young man look like an old god and said, "They will learn to keep a door." Ghost stood for a long moment with his red eyes on the south and then turned his head to the west as if the wind had brought him a new taste. Later that week a shepherd came to the east gate with a fleece that had grown oddly glossy and said he had seen a shape in clouds that looked like a mountain moving. The man at the gate took the story down in a book Conlon had sent north for the keeping of such oddities, because when oddities come true, men should be able to say they were not surprised. Conlon wrote to Sam about a fever in low lanes that sometimes comes when rain follows heat. Sam wrote back a list of herbs and a caution: don't crowd the sick. Crowding can make a city worse in an hour than a battle can make it in a day, and a prayer without being a prayer. Keep the well sweet. He told, almost in an aside, of a dream of a woman in a red field standing with her back to a cold stone while something larger than a ship passed overhead and did not land. He wrote the dream down the way a maester writes a charge into a ledger. Noted, weighed, held. Conlon copied it and placed it under the stone from the wolf's den without telling himself why. The day the house had its first quarrel, two women stood in the door and neither wished to go first. It was over a pan and a word spoken across another's husband's bread. Ordinarily such a quarrel burns and then goes out like a handful of straw. But this one had fuel laid under it by a man who was embarrassed and two boys who had watched men quarrel and thought that was how men are. Arianne came with her stick and did not speak. She stood where the door was in both women's eyes and waited until their breaths changed. "Sit," she said then. "You on that bench. You on this one. Tell me your mother's name." She had learned in a desert that little water can put out a big fire. She had learned in a palace that courtesy, if used like a bowl, catches the overflow of anger so the floor does not stay sticky. She made them say their mother's names and then she made them say the names they hated, and by the time they had said the second set the sting had gone from the first. They cried and were scornful and then they were scornful together at the men who had made it worse. When they left, one took the other's pan because it was better and the first woman said, "Keep it until you've cooked the stew we will both eat." And no one called it a miracle. They called it Tuesday. Jaime rode back to the city to fetch more nails and lime and men with backs that had rested. He came in at twilight by the king's gate and did not look up at the walls until he had passed beneath them. Brienne met him in the yard because she had arranged to be there exactly not by chance. They looked at each other a long moment, not to make a scene of it, to confirm that the other still in fact existed. "The colt," he said, the first words after that looking. "His blaze looks like a hand." "You knew." "I guessed," she said. "Colts do what we cannot." She placed in his palm a strap Gendry had made for the glove's wrist so it would not slide when he sweated. He took it as if it were something ceremonial and then grinned because it was not. "You look well," he added. "You look as if you've learned the language of ditch," she returned, and it would have surprised a younger version of both of them to find how much kindness there was in sarcasm. They stood together for a moment under the new-made hinge that held the kitchen yard door and listened to the bar slide sweetly into its groove. In a different life that sound would not have meant anything to either of them. In this life it was one of the sounds they both trusted. He slept that night in a bed under a window that did not rattle and woke 3 times with his hand reaching for a sword that was in a rack. He smiled in the dark at his own foolishness, and then he let his hand fall and slept again without needing a blade to make him believe it safe. Yara's ships took their stations like sober geese. The Summer Isles warship sat farther off, under oars at times when the wind turned contrary for men who thought themselves above rowing. Davos watched them and wrote on a bit of plank with a coal. 1 long lantern for eastward wind, 2 for west, a horn's short call for ships that do not answer a hail, a long, patient call for a ship with children aboard. The code went up the wall to the signal tower and the boys learned it like a rhyme, the kind that gets into their jump rope and bobs in their heads at night. Vara made a line in a book that said when the Iron Bank's borrowed coin would return itself because a city chose lanterns and not a bravado of cannons. In a lane that had learned quiet, the Red Priest took off his sash at home and folded it carefully. He had enjoyed a sermon earlier where he had said the right number of words and nobody had shouted or thrown him a coin hard enough to bruise. He looked at his hands and saw they were not stained with ash. He liked that more than he had thought he would. He visited the house in the evening and set his palms on the doorpost and said nothing and then went away. When Arya saw him go, she marked it down. Keep. When she saw another man, one who had liked knives more than food, watched the priest with a mouth that did not smile, she marked him down. Cut, not yet, first peel. Ned walked home under a sky that had decided to be clear. He kept his hood down because men watch men with hoods, and he listened to the city talk itself to sleep. He bought a fig from a boy and gave the boy 3 coppers because the boy had stood up straight when he named his price. He stood on the stair before his own door and looked at the stone for a long time and put his hand flat on it. He thought of all the doors he had put his hand on in his life. Doors he had closed to keep snow out, doors he had opened to welcome men back from war, doors he had shut to trouble. He went in to find John with ink on one cuff and a look on his face like a man learning a song he meant to teach to others carefully. "What news?" he asked, and John slid a small folded paper across the table, blue thread at its knot. Ned read and the lines at his mouth deepened. Not grief, a kind of wonder that remains wary because it has been hurt before. "It lives," Ned said softly. "It lives," John echoed. He put his hand on the stone from the wolf's den and then lifted it because he did not think the stone needed to bear him down with this too. He looked out the window and saw only the river and the lanterns in the dark, and then he saw all that and something beyond it and decided, again, to plant and to listen and to count, so that whatever came found the city ready to love what it could love and to withstand what it must withstand. He rose before dawn the next day and went to the yard where the sapling waited under a silent sky. He checked the bar on the door out of habit, and he ran his fingers along the grain of the plank because wood speaks when you touch it often. He stood a long time with his palm against the young tree. He made no vow. He did not need to. He had made the right number of them already. By noon, a woman from the far market had brought a basket of onions to the house and had asked very small for a place to sleep that night. By evening, Davos had caught a smell he did not like on the wind and set a lantern on the signal tower and watched 2 more swing into place in answer in a line that would have made a poet happy. By moonrise, Jamie had sent a man back to Fairmarket with a request for a mason who could lay stone in frost and for a fiddle so the boys would stop drumming on a barrel. By morning of the day after that, Vara had written in 3 ledgers at once with 3 pens and had put 1 pen down and rubbed a cramp out of her hand and laughed because the sound shocked her, and Eleanor had smiled at her and said, "Soup is at noon and we wash hands before, not after," and Vara had nodded because she had learned already that the correct time for washing is a kind of religion with these northerners, and she liked their god of soap. Ships came and went. Wolves moved in the dark off-screen, that is to say, on the other side of a wall built of days. A boy with a crooked tooth stood straighter and began to sound out longer words. Charter, tariff, harbor. And he took the ribbon off his wrist and tied it around the handle of a broom as if the broom were a sword and the harbor court his training yard. The women at the house learned how to lay their bread in the oven in a way that shares heat. Arya learned how long a door could be left ajar before a man remembered to close it. She began to close the right ones. Brienne taught a watchman to move his feet so that mothers could sleep through his beat. Ned wrote to Sansa that the city had learned to keep a promise for 3 days in a row, and that now the trick would be to make that seem ordinary. John slept, woke, counted, forgave, ordered, refused, and was polite with a blade's edge when a man mistook kindness for softness. When trouble came, as it always does, it did not announce itself with drums. It came as a quiet letter with a wet ribbon, a ledger with a line too neat, a small boat under no name slipping in at Bad Alley with a cargo called oil, by men who had not learned to love the harbor court stamp. It came as a storm line on the horizon where the sky turned iron and then thought better of it. It came as a rumor that a triarch had been seen in Volantis, angry and wearing blue. It came as a cracked wheel, a child's cry at midnight that was only a tooth and not a plague, a green spark that fizzed and died in a glass. It came as a man with a scar deciding to go to the river instead of to a counting house, as a woman in a shawl deciding to go to a door instead of to a friend, as a boy turning back to pick up a loaf he had been given to carry because he had dropped it in his hurry, and he refused to bring a dirty loaf to a woman with cuts on her hands. It came as the ordinary test. Will you do the thing you said you would do when no one is watching and when you are tired? They did, more often than not, and when they failed small and in daylight and were corrected by people who loved them enough to be sharp. The realm thickened with such corrections the way a stew thickens when you let it sit and then turn it again and add an onion at the right moment. The house filled and emptied and filled. The ledger's lines grew honest with use. The bridge at Stone Mill held under the weight of a wagon full of flour, and a woman who had the audacity to ride that wagon standing up because she wanted to see what her boy saw when the river ran. The heart tree put out a fifth leaf with no song about it. Only a woman sang to a girl, "Look!" At dusk, under that leaf, John stood with a letter in his hand and said nothing to the man who came and set his hand beside his on the bark and asked nothing. The river moved. The city breathed. The door's bar slid sweetly into its groove when a boy closed it with his new habit. Somewhere far off, a shadow passed over water and did not stop. Yet, in the lane by the harbor court, a little bell made of a fish's spine knocked in the light wind, and a woman felt safe enough to laugh and then scold in that order. In the castle's lowest room, a master of coin and a clerk counted and made a joke about numbers. In the rookery, a candle did not light and a mouse went to sleep full. In the Riverlands, a man with a famous jaw listened to a mason argue with another mason about the angle of a stone and did not interrupt because men should be allowed to make their case about right angles. In Dorne, a woman tapped her stick against a floor, satisfied because a house with her aunt's name in a city she had not loved had become something she could tell her father about without needing to make it seem grander than it was. The work held. It was not done. It was not meant to be. It did not depend on one man's breath, but his breath matched it, and he kept taking that breath and putting it to the service of doors and bridges and ledgers and boys and women and ships and a small tree that did not know what men had done and would yet be kind enough to cover them with shade.